Welcome to the Drowsy Historian, where history isn't just a series of dates and events, but a journey into the past, told in a way that's as soothing as it is fascinating. Join me as we unravel the stories of long-forgotten eras, bring the forgotten voices of the past back to life, and explore history with a calming touch. Whether you're looking to drift into sleep or simply enjoy a relaxing stroll through the pages of time, you're in the right place. Let's get started. Chapter 1. Before the rooster crows. A peasant woman's dawn. It's not the rooster that wakes her. It's the ache in her lower back and the soft moan of her youngest child, curled beside her on a bed made of straw. There's no clock to measure the hour, only the instinct built by seasons of repetition. She knows, without opening her eyes, that it's still dark. The sky outside is ink black, the air in the cottage chill and damp, and the fire has long since turned to embers. She rises before her husband, before the children, before the village itself seems to stir. Her first task is to restart the fire, striking flint against steel with hands that are calloused and cracked. Sparks catch slowly, painfully on bits of dry moss and straw, and a weak flame is born. She doesn't stop to warm herself. Instead, she moves swiftly to prepare bread for the day. Coarse flour, barley or rye wheat, is for the wealthy, mixed with water. Maybe a pinch of salt if they still have some left. It's hard to chew, often bitter. Still, it's the backbone of their meals. And today, like every day, it must be made. There's no kitchen table. She works on a flat stone near the hearth, kneeling, her knees pressing into the dirt floor. The dough must rest, and while it does, she heads outside. The morning frost has not yet lifted. Her breath puffs visibly in the air as she fetches water from the well, heavy wooden buckets dragging down her shoulders. Each step is careful. The path is uneven and slick. Falling means more than bruises. It means spilled water, lost time, possibly illness. By now, her husband might be stirring. He'll expect warm food soon, and clean clothes if she's had time to mend them. The children will wake, whimpering for her attention. She feed them what little there is, often watered-down pottage left over from the night before, made of beans, root vegetables, and wild greens if any were foraged. People often imagine peasants as lazy or ignorant, but the truth is, most peasant women were walking calendars of the natural world. They could tell the month by the feel of the soil, by the behavior of birds, by how the wind curled around the thatch. They were herbalists, seamstresses, cooks, nurses, and laborers, all rolled into one body one that rarely got rest. What few realize is just how constant the labor was. There was no moment of leisure, no sitting to sip a morning drink. Even the act of making a task, often done by women, involved hours of boiling, fermenting, straining, and storing. In fact, for a time, brewing was one of the few ways women could earn small coins. They were called alewives, and some became well known for it. But if their brew failed, they were fined or accused of cheating. The slightest error, too thick, too thin, too sour, could bring shame. And still, as the sun begins to rise and cast its first light over the thatched roofs of the village, her list of chores has barely begun. She needs to tend the small garden outside, check for eggs if they're lucky enough to keep hens, and gather firewood for the evening. If her family shares a pig with another, she must check its pen, clean the muck, and make sure it hasn't fallen ill. Pigs were a prized possession, not pets, but a form of savings, meat for the winter. If it dies, they starve. She is often barefoot, even in winter. Leather shoes are expensive. If she owns any, she reserves them for church. Her feet are thick-skinned and blistered. The hem of her dress is always stained, always damp. She owns only 2, maybe 3 garments, most likely passed down from her mother, patched again and again. Fabric is valuable. A woman who ruins a dress might go years without another. And yet, despite the weight of her daily burden, there's no recognition. Her labor is invisible, expected. Her name won't be written in any book, nor will a priest record her deeds unless she dies. The church speaks of saints and salvation, but not of women like her. She's a ghost in history, a body in the margins. Her husband, when he speaks of her to others, says she's strong, But strength isn't the compliment here. It's another expectation. If she gets sick, she still works. If she's pregnant, she still lifts buckets, tends the fire, cuts kindling. In many villages, women gave birth in the fields, squatting alone, then went right back to their chores. One recorded case from 1278 tells of a woman who delivered twins while gathering barley, bit the cords with her teeth, and continued working. Her neighbors called her blessed, but no one helped her. By midday, she will be exhausted, but no one will ask if she is tired. Her weariness is the background hum of medieval life, ignored and omnipresent. Few people today realize how early gender roles were enforced, even in childhood. Girls as young as 5 were expected to help sweeping, fetching, spinning. By the time they were 10, most knew how to cook, sew, and care for younger siblings. Marriage could come by 12 or 13. Puberty wasn't a sign of growth. It was a signal to reproduce. And so the cycle began again, often without her consent. She rarely stops to think of what she's become. There's no room for reflection in a life of endless motion. She moves from task to task, always a step ahead of failure, always bracing for the next misfortune. Hunger doesn't come in waves anymore. It's just there, steady, dull, like the ache in her back and the tightness in her hands. Once, she used to sing while working, a habit passed down from her mother, but even that has faded with time. There's little breath to spare for music when breath itself is work. In the late morning, she brings in firewood. Most people today don't realize how heavy green wood is, how it drips with moisture and refuses to burn unless dried properly. But there are no neat stacks of seasoned logs here. Everything burns eventually, even dung. If she lives in a lowland village, she gathers turf from the peat bogs, hauling soddy clumps home in a rough sack. Her back strains, her hands blister, and yet her work won't be noticed unless it's undone. If the fire goes out, it's her fault. If the hearth is cold when her husband returns, he'll remind her of her duty. Some might think of village women leaned on each other, sharing burdens and laughing at fate. And sometimes, yes, they did. But the truth is harsher. Poverty breeds suspicion. A woman who borrows too much is resented. A woman whose child dies might be whispered about. Envy takes root easily when there's barely enough to go around. One girl's beauty might make her a target. One woman's misfortune might be seen as divine punishment. By noon, the cottage fills with smoke again. The hearth has no chimney, only a small vent in the roof or a hole in the thatch. Smoke clings to her hair, stings her eyes, settles into the walls. The children cough, and so does she. Lung sickness is a slow death no one names. It takes years, and no one blames the house. It's simply the way things are. A rare fact that escapes many textbooks is that medieval women often chewed on tree bark, not for flavor, but to numb tooth pain. Willow bark, in particular, was known for its soothing properties, something modern medicine would later isolate as salicylic acid, the base for aspirin. But she doesn't know science. She just knows the pain dulls when she chews. A few leaves, a pinch of crushed mint, whatever grows in the hedgerows, these are her remedies. The apothecary is for those with coin, and she has none to spare. After tending to food, she may sit briefly to spin wool. It's not leisure, it's survival. The wool must be cleaned, carded, spun, and sometimes dyed. If the family is lucky enough to own a sheep, the wool becomes garments for winter. If not, she spins for others in exchange for bread or soap. One spinning wheel, a wooden stool, and endless fibers. This is her afternoon. But here's a fact few know, the English word distaff, meaning the female side of the family comes from the actual tool women used to hold wool while spinning. The association between womanhood and spinning was so absolute that it shaped language itself. A girl's destiny was so tightly bound to thread and fiber that her entire lineage could be labeled by the tools in her hands. Outside, the men plow fields or repair thatch, but their work, however hard, ends with the sun. Hers continues. She mends shirts, scrubs stains with sand and cold water, scours cooking pots blackened with soot. If there's no soap, she boils ash with water and lard to make some. Her nails are worn to the quick. Her skin is rough and raw. She might be 25, but she looks 40. The life wears you down faster than any calendar. Some evenings, if the weather is kind and the Lord's taxes have not bitten too deeply, there's a brief window of stillness. Children play with pebbles or bits of straw. She may sit on a stool, rub her feet, and watch the sky darken. In those moments, she doesn't think of what she lacks. She listens to the wind, the rustle of trees, the distant bark of a dog. But even then, her body hums with unfinished tasks. The calm never lasts. A curious detail from 14th century village records shows that even when women gave birth, they were expected to return to work within days. There was no recovery period, no bed rest. If anything, a woman staying in bed too long could be viewed as lazy or cursed. A known case from Yorkshire tells of a mother fined for not showing up to 10 fields 2 days after childbirth. The law made no exception for pain. As dusk settles, she starts supper. It will be another thick stew of what little is left: turnip, cabbage, a pinch of barley, if there's any left. She feeds the children first, waits to see if her husband wants more, and only eats what remains. Her hunger is constant, but she never names it aloud. After supper, she might tend the fire again, gather the children into bed, and strip off her outer clothes. She sleeps in the same shift she wore all day. The bed is not soft. Straw and cloth sacks lie beneath thin bodies, sometimes shared with pigs or chickens in colder months. The room smells of sweat, smoke, animals, and fatigue. There's no such thing as privacy. If her husband turns to her, she cannot say no. That word is not hers to use. The irony is sharp. In a world where her labor sustains the family, her needs are invisible. She is essential but forgotten, needed but unheard. The law does not recognize her as an individual. She is her husband's property, her children's nurse, the village's silent engine. When she cries, no one notices. When she dies, someone else will rise in her place the next morning, before the rooster crows, to start it all again. She does not dream of escape. There is no escape. Only endurance. Only the hope that her children might suffer slightly less than she did. That hope is her quiet prayer in the darkness. Tomorrow, she will wake again before the fire, before the bread, before her name is remembered, and the world will turn as it always has on her back. Chapter 2. Mud, Smoke, and Men. Living Conditions. The cottage was her entire world. 4 walls made from wattle and daub sticks and mud packed together by a hand barely wide enough to stretch your arms. Its roof sagged under the weight of old thatch, bundled reeds patched with moss, straw, or turf. When it rained, the roof whispered water down into the corners of the room. In winter, it soaked through. In spring, it dripped slowly through the same place no matter how many times she tried to fix it. Inside, the smell hit first. Smoke always. It wrapped itself around everything: her clothes, her bedding, her food, her hair. There was no chimney. The hearth in the center of the room sent its fumes curling upward until they pooled in the thatch like a fog with nowhere to go. The only escape was through a small hole in the roof or the gaps in the walls, if they were lucky. Most women learned to cook with tears in their eyes. Children coughed themselves awake. Many lived and died with the black residue of ash deep in their lungs. The floor was not wood, not even stone, but packed dirt. She swept it daily with a bundle of twigs. That was more habit than hygiene. No matter how many times she swept, the earth remained damp, sometimes sticky, always cold. And when it rained heavily, water pooled in the corners and soaked into the straw bedding. In summer, the earth grew dusty and dry. It rose up with every step, coating the inside of the house like a powder. Their bed was shared, she, her husband, and their children. A large sack of straw, sometimes mixed with feathers if they could afford it, laid across wooden boards or just the ground. The straw attracted bugs. Lice, fleas, and mites made their homes in the folds of cloth. Each night was a restless battle between sleep and scratching. Few peasant women ever knew what it felt like to wake refreshed. Rest was not something they experienced. It was just a pause between chores. Privacy was non-existent. The cottage was one room. There were no separate bedrooms, no walls to pull shut. Her husband might want to lie with her while children snored just feet away. If she resisted, he had the law on his side. She was not permitted to withhold herself. Her body was a part of the household inventory, just like the cooking pot and the spinning wheel. They lived beside animals, not in lawns, but in the home itself. Chickens might roam freely through the room. A piglet might sleep in the corner on especially cold nights. Goats, if they had any, were sometimes brought inside to keep them safe from theft or wolves. In the early morning, she would step over dung to reach the fire. By midday, the flies would already be buzzing around the door. A surprising detail from 13th century manorial records describes how some families, unable to afford firewood, would burn dried cow dung or peat for warmth. The resulting smoke was heavy and acidic. It clung to the back of your throat, made your eyes sting, and painted the walls black. It was all they had. Trees belonged to the Lord. Cutting one down without permission could mean a fine or worse. Every surface in the cottage carried marks of their struggle. The cooking pot, blackened with use, hung over the fire by an iron hook. It rarely came off. Meals were one-pot affairs, simple stews made from what was available, often tasting of ash and overboiled cabbage. The wooden bowls, rough-hewn and warped with age, were wiped clean with bread or cloth. Soap was too precious to waste on dishes. Above the fire hung a single shelf, if they had one. This held whatever valuables they possessed. A rosary, perhaps a carved spoon or a small wooden cross. These were treasures not because they were rare in the wider world, but because they had survived the grind of peasant life. Every possession was earned through labor or luck. Clothes were stored in a chest, if the family was fortunate. More often, they were hung from pegs on the wall. A woman's dresses were few. Maybe 2 linen shifts, a wool tunic, an apron, and a shawl. They were mended constantly, the same cloth re-stitched dozens of times until the fabric barely held. The idea of changing clothes daily would have sounded ridiculous to her. Washing garments required boiling water, ash soap, and endless scrubbing. It tore the fabric down faster than wearing it. In summer, the heat made the cottage almost unbearable. The walls trapped the warmth, turning the single room into an oven. The air became thick with the stench of sweat, spoiled food, and livestock. Insects swarmed freely through the open door in tiny cracks. She might sleep with a cloth over her face, not for comfort, but to keep gnats from crawling into her mouth. Winters were worse. Bitter cold seeped through every crack. She stuffed straw into the gaps, layered cloth over the door, and sometimes even pressed dried mud into the walls to block wind. Still, her fingers would grow stiff, her joints ache, her breath fog with each exhale. Children huddled under whatever scraps of wool or fur they had. Frostbite was common, especially among the poor. Toes turned black and numb. There was no treatment, only prayer and patience. Rarely did people speak of the emotional weight such surroundings carried. A single room shared by all meant no quiet. No time to be alone. Arguments echoed. Grief had no corner to hide in. If a baby died in the night, she would wake beside its cold body and have to carry it out past the animals, the ashes, and the eyes of her other children. And still, this was life, not the worst life. Even many villagers envied those who had sturdy roofs or dry walls. For a woman, the home was not a refuge. It was a battlefield of work, illness, hunger, and exhaustion. There was no doorway wide enough to escape through. One forgotten detail from medieval housekeeping manuals mentions how women were often tasked with smearing fresh cow dung on the earthen floors to reduce dust and pests. It dried quickly, acted as insulation, and was considered a mark of good housekeeping. She would kneel with a wooden trowel and smooth it out herself, and then, without complaint, continue with the day. Even in this environment of dirt and hardship, the pressure to appear orderly persisted. If a visiting priest arrived and her home was unkempt, it reflected badly not just on her, but on her husband. Discipline was her duty. Cleanliness was her virtue. A tidy home, even if made of mud and soot, was a sign of piety, and she kept trying. Each morning, she swept the dirt. Each evening, she lit the fire again. Her home was no palace. It was barely a shelter, but it was hers to keep upright, no matter how the rain fell or the wind tore through the gaps. The home was not hers by law, even though she cleaned every corner of it with her hands, bent over until her back ached. The land it stood on belonged to the lord of the manor. The walls might have been built by her father or grandfather, yet still they were technically property of another man. She could be cast out if her husband displeased the lord or failed to meet the year's labor quota. And if her husband died, the situation became even more precarious. Many widows found themselves evicted within days of their spouse's burial, left to beg or remarry within the village before starvation took hold. The village itself was a tight web of similar homes. Narrow dirt paths connected each hovel like veins. In wet seasons, they turned to deep mud. There were no drains, no gravel, no clean paths. Pigs wandered freely. So did geese and chickens pecking at refuse. The smell of manure was constant. Children ran barefoot through the muck, carrying the filth into the homes without notice. Mothers tried to wipe it away, but by the end of each day, everyone's feet were stained the color of the earth. At the village center might be a communal well or stream, where women gathered to draw water and sometimes to wash clothes. The water was rarely clean. Upstream, livestock drank and defecated. Downstream, waste was dumped. Disease spread with invisible speed. Still, there was no alternative. She would rise early to fetch water in wooden buckets, often walking long distances and returning with her arms sore and splinters pressed into her fingers. If she dropped one or spilled it on the way, she would go back and do it again. No one else would volunteer to carry the burden. One rarely discussed fact is that many peasant women gave birth to babies suffering from waterborne diseases even before the first cough or fever appeared. Infant mortality was so high that most women expected to lose at least one child before they themselves reached 30. A woman might carry 5 or 6 children and only see 2 live long enough to walk. There was no naming ceremony until the priest baptized the child, often days after birth, because no one wanted to name the dead. She lived with death as a daily guest. It was in the coughing of the elderly, the hollow cheeks of her neighbors, the blisters on her own feet. It was in the river where a girl disappeared last winter. It was in the barn where the family's only cow collapsed from illness and could not be revived. Every sound at night carried a weight. The wind might slam a shutter or howl under the thatch, but she would rise anyway, convinced that something, somewhere, had gone wrong. Yet, despite the constant anxiety, there was an order to the misery. Her world moved with the seasons. Spring brought hope, along with flooding and hunger. Summer offered light, but demanded long days in the fields. Autumn meant the pressure of harvest, of storing food before frost returned. And winter, most cruelly, offered nothing but long nights and sickness. In some corners of Europe, records show that villagers mixed dried heather and herbs into the thatch of their roofs, not for fragrance, but to ward off vermin and evil spirits. Some women hung sprigs of elder or rowan above the doorway, ancient symbols believed to protect from death or misfortune. These acts were part survival, part prayer, part desperate hope. She didn't always believe in the protection, but she followed the custom, just in case. Inside the home, light came from the fire or from tallow candles, if she could make them. Animal fat was rendered down, poured into horn molds, and fitted with a wick. They burned with a thick, greasy smoke and gave little light. Still, even that flicker could mean the difference between cutting her finger while slicing onions or finishing the evening stitching without ruining the thread. She never really sat in a chair. Chairs were rare, made by hand, and reserved for elders or guests. Most women sat on stools of the ground. Her body adapted. She learned to kneel for hours without complaint, her knees hardening like stone. Her hands became so skilled at weaving, spinning, stirring, and scrubbing that she could perform tasks in near darkness without mistake. Yet, if a man from the church entered and saw her work, he might say her place was beneath him, even as he admired the clean hearth she had tended since dawn. A tiny scrap of dignity came in the form of the hearth fire. Women were often seen as guardians of the flame, not just literally, but spiritually. If a household's fire went out, it was not merely an inconvenience. It was shameful. Fire was life. Some women were known to carry embers wrapped in moss for miles if a storm or accident extinguished their hearth. Lending fire to a neighbor was an act of trust. Losing it could mean nights without food or warmth. She rarely went far from her home. Travel was dangerous, expensive, and often forbidden. Women could be accused of wandering for illicit reasons, and any mishap along the road bandits' illness. Suspicion would fall back on their reputation. The farthest she might go was the church, the fields, or the Lord's granary. And even there, she moved with caution. One step out of line could bring gossip, punishment, or worse. Curiously, some villages had small wooden locks, not for doors, but for chests and boxes inside. Personal space, if it existed, was contained in these wooden compartments. A woman might keep a spindle, a carved spoon, a tiny comb, or a letter inside. These were her treasures, even if they held no value to anyone else. When she opened that box, she touched something that was hers alone, in a life where almost nothing belonged to her. Even her thoughts were not truly private. The church warned of sinful minds. She had to confess unspoken temptations, dreams, or doubts. If she felt resentment, she was told to pray it away. If she questioned her husband's authority, she was reminded of Eve. And if she dared to speak too much, too loudly, or too cleverly, she might be labeled a troublemaker, or worse, a woman to be watched. Despite it all, she kept the home running. Each wall smeared with smoke and patched with earth stood only because she maintained it. Every meal, no matter how bland or thin, came from her labor. Every child who survived did so because of her vigilance. Every night they slept under a roof was due to her constant repair. She did not think of herself as strong. She thought of herself as necessary. And that, perhaps, was the heaviest burden of all. Chapter 3. Womb of Burden, Childbirth, and Miscarriage. She knew the signs well before the quickening. The ache in her lower back, the tension in her belly, the nausea that arrived with the dawn and lingered until dusk. She had felt them before. Each time it was the same quiet mixture of dread and resignation. There was no joy in the knowledge. Not at first. Not when she could barely feed the children already under her care. Not when her body had not yet recovered from the last labor. Pregnancy was not celebrated. It was expected. In a world where infant death was common and women were often married by 14, most peasant women bore child after child until their bodies simply gave out. Contraception, though practiced quietly and carefully, was condemned by the church. Herbs like pennyroyal and tansy were known, whispered about between older women, used sparingly and at great risk. If she was caught using them, she might be accused of sorcery or sin. If the herbs failed, she faced another round of carrying, birthing, and feeding. She never saw a physician. Doctors, if they even practiced nearby, charged fees her family could never afford. Instead, she turned to older women, midwives, or neighbors with experience. These women held a knowledge passed from mother to daughter. How to massage a womb, how to coax a breech baby, how to cut the cord with a clean edge of pottery when a knife was not available. But even the best midwife could not guarantee safety. One misstep, one turn of the baby, one long night with no progress, and the mother might bleed out onto the floor with no one to save her. Pain relief was a luxury she never imagined. She bit down on a cloth or clenched her jaw until her teeth ached. Some women sang, some screamed, some wept quietly into the straw. The birth took place wherever there was room. Often on a blanket near the fire, sometimes in the field, sometimes alone if help came too late. Her children might watch from the corner of the room. Her husband, unless unusually kind or frightened, rarely assisted. This was women's work. And if she died, he would remarry within the season. Few modern people realize that medieval peasant women often returned to their chores within days, sometimes hours of giving birth. They cut the cord, swaddled the infant, and went back to kneading dough or gathering firewood. One historical record from a Flemish village in the late 1200s describes a woman who birthed a child at night and was seen milking cows by morning. She was praised by her neighbors for her endurance, but no one asked about her pain. Endurance was not heroic. It was demanded. There were no cribs, no blankets with soft colors. A baby might sleep in a wooden drawer, a cloth bundle hung from a beam, or nestled beside its mother on a straw pallet. Most infants were not named until baptism, which could be delayed if the priest was unavailable or if the roads were impassable. Until then, they were called simply the baby. Sometimes, when a child died before baptism, The mother was told not to mourn too loudly. The soul had not yet been purified. Grief could be mistaken for rebellion against God's will. There is one haunting tradition from parts of rural France and England, mostly forgotten today. When a woman gave birth to a stillborn child, the community sometimes buried the baby beneath the threshold of the home. It was believed the soul would protect the family and that the earth closest to the door held sacred power. She would walk over that hidden grave every day, carrying wood, food, or children, never speaking aloud of what lay beneath her feet. Her own body bore the cost of each pregnancy. Teeth fell out, bones weakened, her spine curved under the weight of labor and lifting. Calcium deficiency, though unknown by name, showed in her gait and posture. Pelvic injuries from difficult births often went untreated. Some women leaked urine or bled for weeks afterward, developing fistulas that caused pain and shame for the rest of their lives. And then there were the miscarriages, spoken of only in whispers. She might wake one morning with cramps, find blood in her linen, and know instantly that life had been lost. There was no ceremony, no priest to say a few words. She cleaned herself with cold water, said a prayer, and got on with the day. If anyone noticed her swollen eyes or pale face, they said nothing. Loss was expected. Pain was normal. Her grief belonged to no one but herself. When she gave birth successfully, there was still no guarantee of peace. Babies cried through the night, coughed through the winter, wasted away with fevers, or failed to thrive. The burden of feeding fell solely to her. If her milk failed, there was no formula, no replacement. Goat milk might be used, or bread soaked in warm water, but malnutrition often followed. If the child died, she was blamed. Maybe she worked too soon, maybe she angered God, maybe she failed in prayer. Even other women sometimes looked at her with suspicion, believing she had not done all she could. Interestingly, in parts of Scandinavia, a peculiar folk belief persisted for centuries. If a child cried too much, it was thought to be a changeling, a spirit or troll child swapped for the real one. Some mothers, desperate and exhausted, left their babies briefly outside in the cold to test this theory. If the child stopped crying, it was believed to be human after all. Few speak today of the infants lost during these tests. Fewer still blame the women who, driven by fear and sleep deprivation, saw no other option. Through all of this, she rarely had a choice. Consent was not discussed. A woman's fertility was her identity, her role, her fate. She could not refuse her husband. She could not refuse her body. Her womb was not her own. It belonged to her family, her church, her village, and yet she carried on. With every child, she loved fiercely. She sang lullabies passed down for generations. She rocked them in her arms while stitching hems by firelight. She whispered old stories and pressed soft kisses to their foreheads. She memorized their tiny fingers and hoped they would live long enough to remember her voice. But deep down, she knew the truth. She knew that every new life might be another crack in her bones, another toll on her heart. And still, she opened herself to it, again and again, not out of choice, but because that was what the world demanded of her. After childbirth, a woman was expected to return to normal life quickly, but her body often told another story. Bleeding might continue for weeks. Fever, known then only as childbed fever, crept in with no warning and no cure. The womb, unclean in the eyes of the church, required ritual purification before she could rejoin society. Until then, she was considered spiritually tainted. The church's rites dictated a churching ceremony, often held 40 days after birth, to formally reintegrate the mother. Only after this blessing could she walk freely into church again. Until then, she was half present in the village, half forgotten behind her door. She did not ask for rest. There was none. If she stayed in bed too long, she risked being called lazy or cursed. Women who took to their beds were suspected of inviting illness. Her strength was not praised, it was demanded. She was expected to endure quietly and return to work, even as her abdomen still throbbed and her milk-soaked shift clung to her aching skin. The newborn, too, became another layer of labor. Feeding, rocking, cleaning, all with one hand while she stirred pots, kneaded dough, or gathered kindling with the other. Sleep became an idea, not a reality. She slept in fragments, interrupted by cries, by cold, by the needs of her other children. If she lived in a village where the custom was to share bedding, the baby's cries might disturb the entire household, and shame would follow. She learned to silence her child quickly. She learned to nurse without sound, to hush with a gentle sway or whispered chant. One forgotten medieval lullaby spoke not of dreams and stars, but of hunger and protection, promising the baby that wolves would not come tonight and that bread would still be here by morning. When her child grew sick, and most did, there was little she could do. Fever came with little warning. A cough could become death. There were no thermometers, no concept of germs. She would try warm broth, herbal compresses, prayers said over the child's body. She might burn a bit of sage or swing the infant gently beneath the moonlight. The midwife, if summoned, might bring a charm or offer a bitter tincture. And still, many babies died in her arms before their first birthday. Grief was not a private affair. A woman mourning too openly was told to accept God's will. Those who mourned too little were accused of being cold. There was no correct way to suffer. She learned to cry while chopping vegetables or to grieve while spinning wool, her tears falling soundless onto the thread. If the child had been baptized, it was buried with a proper prayer. If not, it might be buried in silence, sometimes outside consecrated ground. Some mothers carried tiny stones in their apron pockets to remember the ones they had lost. One stone for each life. The weight never left them. Rarely do people today understand how fragile a woman's place in the household became after repeated losses. If too many babies died under her care, even if from natural causes, the village began to whisper. Perhaps she was cursed. Perhaps she had offended God. Perhaps she was not pious enough. These rumors could unravel her standing. A husband might take another wife if he believed she was barren or unlucky. In a life where a woman had so little, even her womb was not fully hers. It was a measure of her worth, her devotion, her success as a peasant. In some remote villages, miscarriages were treated with fearful superstition. A woman who bled before full term might be seen as suspect. Some believed she had tampered with herbs. Others thought she had spoken to spirits or failed to confess a sin. There were no doctors to explain chromosomal issues or uterine weakness. There was only silence, then shame. She might hide the blood-stained cloth and pretend nothing had happened. No one would ask. She would bury her pain alongside her child's memory and go on. Despite this cruelty, women supported each other in hidden ways. Midwives, often viewed with suspicion by the male clergy, carried generations of knowledge. They taught young girls how to understand their cycles, how to rest their bodies when they could, and how to manage their health with what little nature offered. In some places, women gathered secretly in groves or near wells to exchange herbs and stories, to name their dead in quiet ceremony, to whisper power into a world that refused to recognize it. One remarkable medieval document from a convent in northern Italy records a recipe for a healing salve made from sheep's fat, wild thyme, and beeswax applied to torn skin after childbirth. It was passed from nun to nun, never shared with the men of the church. These small remedies, though unknown to most of the world, made all the difference between agony and recovery. Yet with each new child, the pattern began again. A flicker of hope perhaps that this one might live, might thrive, might outlast the cruel statistics that had taken so many before. She would cradle the baby close, smell the warmth of its breath, and pray not with words from a book, but with the beat of her own heart that this child would live to see the changing of seasons. She never stopped loving, even when love so often ended in loss. Her resilience was quiet, not the kind told in stories of queens or saints. She did not wield swords or rule from thrones. Her courage was found in the smallest places, in the act of rising again after loss, of facing another labor, of singing softly to a baby, even as her hands bled from gathering thorns. The womb was her burden, but also her power. It held her sorrow and her strength, and in its silent pain, it bore the weight of the entire village. History forgot her name, but her body carried the village's future. Her voice whispered lullabies into the bones of the next generation, and her hands shaped a life that others took for granted. She never had the chance to rest, but she built the world with every breath she drew. Chapter 4. Silence Her Tongue. Obedience and Patriarchy. Her world was shaped by obedience, and her silence was considered a virtue. From the moment she could walk, she was told to lower her eyes, to speak only when spoken to, and to serve others before herself. She learned early that a woman's worth was measured in how little trouble she caused, how few questions she asked, and how easily she submitted. The patriarchy was not just a structure of law or faith. It was the air she breathed, the rules stitched into her daily life. Marriage was not a matter of affection or even choice. It was survival. Girls as young as 12 were married off by their fathers, not for love, but for land, animals, or security. A small flock of chickens, a few coins, a shared field. These were the terms of union. Sometimes the groom was twice her age. Sometimes she met him on the day of the wedding. It did not matter. Once married, she was his. Her body, her work, her womb all belonged to her husband. The law backed this arrangement. A husband could discipline his wife without fear of punishment. If she spoke too freely, he could strike her. If she questioned his decisions, she was considered disobedient. There were no courts for her to run to, no advocates on her side. The church often preached that a husband should love his wife, but more often it reminded wives to submit. Obedience was godliness. Rebellion was sin. In many villages, the church's influence was absolute. Priests reminded women of their place through sermons, stories, and confession. Eve was to blame for the fall of mankind. Women, it was said, were the weaker vessel, the gateway of sin. This doctrine was not abstract. It bled into how she was treated daily. If her husband failed in his crops or fortune, people might whisper that she had cursed him. If she laughed too loud or dressed too brightly, she risked being accused of vanity or worse. Even her voice was suspect. A woman who spoke in public too confidently could be labeled dangerous. In one documented case from an English manor in the 1320s, a woman was fined for publicly arguing with a male neighbor. Her words alone were deemed disruptive to the peace. The same words from a man would have been seen as assertive. From her, they were insubordination. In some households, fathers enforced rules with brutal consistency. Girls were taught to bow their heads, to cover themselves, to defer to their brothers. Her brother might learn letters and numbers. She learned to mend, to knead, to hush her thoughts. Education was rare for girls, and those who learned to read often did so in secret or through the kindness of an aging relative. Books, when they existed, belonged to the men. And yet, even with so little voice, she bore all the blame. If her children misbehaved, it was a mark on her character. If her husband grew bitter or cruel, it was said she failed to soothe him. If there was no food, no warmth, no peace in the home, the finger pointed to her. The pressure was relentless, and it came from every direction. Other women, taught the same rules, often upheld them just as fiercely. She was judged not just by men, but by the entire community. One especially cruel tradition that existed in several English and German towns was the use of the scold's bridle. This was a metal cage fastened around a woman's head with a small iron plate pushed into the mouth to prevent speech. It was reserved for women who were seen as quarrelsome or outspoken. Public shaming accompanied the punishment. She would be marched through the streets, silenced by force, laughed at by neighbors. Her only crime was using her voice. Even in the best of circumstances, she lived in a state of constant self-monitoring. Every word, every glance, every step had to be calculated. She could not walk alone without suspicion. She could not sit beside a man, not her husband. She could not dance too freely or sing too loudly. The rules were many, unwritten, and always waiting to be broken. In certain corners of Europe, a woman could be tried as a heretic simply for questioning a priest's teaching. Inquisitions were not limited to witches or philosophers. Poor women who spoke their minds, interpreted dreams, or passed along folk wisdom could be condemned. One woman in 14th century Bohemia was accused of heresy after teaching children a lullaby that included non-biblical imagery. Her words were examined for sedition. She vanished from the records shortly after. At home, she had no sanctuary. Her husband was her master. If he chose to share affection, she accepted it with gratitude. If he chose cruelty, she bore it with clenched teeth. The law saw her as property. A man could not be accused of raping his wife. Consent was not a recognized concept. The bed was not hers to control. But even within this cage of silence, women found slivers of resistance. They spoke to one another while tending the fires, whispered over baskets of laundry, shared scraps of stories passed down from mothers and grandmothers. Through these stories, they held on to identity. They remembered the names of women who had healed with herbs, who had protected children with charms, who had saved lives when the churchmen failed. In some households, women carved symbols onto beams or under door lintels. These signs, called apotropaic marks, were meant to ward off evil spirits, but they also marked territory. A line carved into wood that said, "Here I see, here I know." These were not just superstitions. They were unspoken protests, tiny acts of control in a world where nothing was truly theirs. She could not escape the patriarchy. It defined every breath she took. But she learned how to live inside it, how to survive the endless scrutiny, how to raise children with gentleness even when none was shown to her. She grew a spine beneath her silence, and while the world never listened, she carried entire families on the strength of her quiet endurance. She understood that survival meant adaptation. A sharp tongue could cost her reputation, or worse, her safety. So she became fluent in the language of silence pauses, glances, small deferential nods. She learned how to disagree without speaking, how to push her children forward without drawing attention to herself, how to influence a husband's decision while making it seem like his own idea. These were not the tools of rebellion, but the strategies of someone who had no other weapons left. Within the walls of the village, authority wore many faces. Her husband, of course, ruled her domestic life. The parish priest loomed over her spiritual worth. The reeve and bailiff watched for mistakes that might impact the manor's economy. And then there were the other women, older and sharper, who upheld the norms just as ruthlessly. These enforcers were often widows or mothers-in-law who had survived by aligning themselves with the rules. If she slipped up, if she appeared too bold, too idle, too lucky, word would spread, and judgment would follow. Even kindness was controlled. If she showed too much affection to a neighbor's child, some might accuse her of witchcraft. If she shared a loaf of bread, it might be questioned whether she had stolen the flour. Generosity, if not sanctioned by the hierarchy, became dangerous. So she practiced modest gestures. A bowl of soup placed quietly at someone's door. A bundle of herbs left without explanation. She gave what she could while pretending it came from nowhere. Few today realize that even motherhood had rules written by men. A mother's discipline had limits. If her husband disagreed with how she handled a child's misbehavior, he could overrule her instantly. Her affection was expected to be endless, her patience tireless, her results perfect. Yet she had no authority of her own. She could not prevent her son from being conscripted or her daughter from being married off. She could only prepare them as best she could, knowing the world would take them regardless of her will. In some medieval households, women created what were known as charm books, collections of herbal remedies. Protective prayers and household spells written in their own hand or copied from older women. These fragile volumes were hidden in trunks or under the floorboards, not just because they were private, but because owning such knowledge could be seen as suspicious or subversive. A woman with a charm book was sometimes admired in secret and feared in public. Her wisdom could be dismissed with one accusation, her healing mistaken for manipulation. Education was rare, but it did exist in slivers. A few nuns and older widows taught younger girls to read, often using psalters or bits of Latin prayers. But beyond these spiritual lessons, girls were warned not to seek more. Too much learning, they said, would spoil a wife. An educated woman might grow proud, question her place, or worse, reject the man chosen for her. Stories circulated about noble women who went mad from too much reading, as if literacy itself was a kind of illness. So she learned in secret through songs, embroidery patterns, and overheard conversations. Even her body was a source of communal judgment. If she grew too thin, people whispered about her health or her sins. If she gained weight, they asked if she was with child. If she walked too proudly, it was vanity. If she bent too low, it was weakness. Her appearance was not hers to define. It was measured, dissected, and policed by others. There was no escape from the gaze of the village. Marriage contracts reinforced this powerlessness. In many regions, the dowry system bound her to obligations before she had any say. Her father gave too little, her worth was questioned. If he gave too much, she became a target of envy. Once married, she had no control over these arrangements, yet they shaped her future entirely. If the marriage turned sour, she had no legal grounds to leave. A woman abandoning her husband, even in cases of cruelty, could be labeled a runaway, fined, or punished with public shame. The church's teachings on marriage were clear. A woman must serve her husband in all ways. Denial of intimacy was grounds for complaint. If he strayed, it was often forgiven. If she strayed, even if out of desperation or coercion, she risked being cast out. One church council in the 13th century issued a rule stating that if a wife was found to be unfaithful, her punishment should be decided by her husband's temper and not the court's mercy. In many villages, this translated to humiliation or violence carried out behind closed doors. Yet within these narrow spaces, she found small freedoms. She found companionship in other women, those who also labored quietly, who also knew what it was to bite their tongues and smile when the burden felt unbearable. Together, they created a code of expression. A gesture might mean more than a sentence. A shared look could say everything. In the rhythm of kneading dough, hanging clothes, or braiding hair, they found unspoken solidarity. In some corners of medieval society, there were rare exceptions. A widow of means, if childless and without male relatives, could own property and make decisions for herself. But even then, the moment she remarried, all her rights transferred to her new husband. The law followed the man. Her brief taste of autonomy vanished as quickly as it came. A handful of women defied this structure altogether. Records mention women who refused marriage, who lived alone and worked as midwives, herbalists, or keepers of village lore. But these women lived with the constant threat of being labeled witches, especially during times of fear or famine. Their independence, once respected, could be weaponized against them with a single accusation. For most, the only path was patience. She did not speak loudly, but she made herself known through consistency. She did not challenge the system directly, but she wove resistance into the fabric of daily life. Her silence was not absence. It was calculation, a learned stillness that said more than words ever could. She raised sons who sometimes understood and daughters who always did. She passed down the truth in stories embroidered into blankets, in the way she moved through her day, in the names she whispered while combing her daughter's hair. The patriarchy may have silenced her voice, but it could never erase her message. And even now, buried in the dust of forgotten cottages, the weight of her obedience lingers. Not as defeat, but as evidence of what it took to survive. Chapter 5. Scrubbing Souls, Religion's Grip. Her spiritual life was not her own. From her earliest memories, religion had wrapped itself around every moment of her day. The village church stood not just as a place of worship, but as the center of judgment, instruction, and fear. Bells marked the hours. Latin prayers filled the air. Statues of saints stared with unmoving eyes. And she, kneeling on the cold stone floor, learned quickly that salvation was not guaranteed, and sin could be as small as a thought. She could not read the Bible. It was written in Latin, locked behind a language she would never be taught. The priest, the only literate man many villagers ever knew, was both spiritual shepherd and social enforcer. He interpreted scripture, dictated morals, and handed out punishments, not just for crimes, but for deviations in thought. A woman's doubt was heresy. Her questions were rebellion. Her suffering was penance for Eve's first mistake. Each Sunday, she walked to church in her cleanest shift, sometimes barefoot, sometimes with a shawl around her head. as a sign of humility. The priest's voice echoed across the nave as he preached about the virtue of obedience and the dangers of lust, gluttony, and pride. These words were not vague warnings. They had names and faces. Lust was her body. Pride was her voice. Gluttony was her hunger. The church offered no sanctuary from the burdens she already carried. It simply repainted them in divine light and called it righteous. Confession was required. Once a year, she knelt before a man who asked her to speak every dark impulse, every anger, every envy. She confessed her impatience, her exhaustion, her moments of bitterness. She rarely spoke of her true burdens, the quiet rage, the thoughts she had while rocking a sick child through the night, the desire to run away and disappear into the forest. Those were dangerous truths. Even the priest could not be trusted with them. There were expectations, fasting on Fridays, attending Mass on holy days, giving alms when there was nothing left to give. She was told that every small sin stained her soul like soot on a cloth. Only obedience could scrub it clean. But no matter how hard she tried, her soul never felt white. Her life was filled with dust, blood, and ash. How could it not follow her into confession? Even childbirth, the most natural act in her life, was labeled unclean. After labor, she was considered impure. She could not enter the church, take communion, or even speak certain prayers until she underwent a ritual purification. The churching ceremony was brief, just a prayer and a blessing, but it reminded her that her body, the same one that fed and nurtured life, was also a source of defilement. The church taught that suffering was sacred. A woman who bore hardship without complaint earned a place in heaven. Saints were held up as examples. Saint Margaret, who was swallowed by a dragon and escaped through the sign of the cross. Saint Cecilia, who sang through her execution. These stories were meant to inspire, but they also set an impossible standard. She was expected to suffer with a smile, to bleed with faith, to serve without recognition. Relics were treated with reverence. A splinter of wood said to be from the true cross, a vial of saint's blood, or a piece of cloth touched to a martyr's bones. These objects were paraded through the village in times of plague or famine, carried by priests with solemn expressions. She watched from the crowd, holding her child tightly, wondering if the saint's touch would reach her in the mud and cold. It never seemed to. In some regions, the church held records of every villager's attendance. Miss too many services, and you might be visited by the parish clerk or fined by the Lord. Religion was not a matter of belief. It was a requirement. And for women, it was especially strict. They were warned against vanity, against speaking too freely, against thinking too deeply. The Virgin Mary was the ideal silent, pure obedient. Anything less was a stain against God's design. One forgotten detail from ecclesiastical courts in the 14th century shows that women were often punished for immodest behavior, not by legal standards, but by community rumor. A woman could be summoned simply for being seen walking alone at dusk, or for laughing too loudly in the presence of men. The church would question her, often with no evidence but whispers. She would kneel, swear innocence, and pray the questioning ended without punishment. Sometimes it did. Sometimes it did not. Miracles were spoken of often, but rarely seen. The priest might tell of a blind man healed in a far-off land or a statue that wept real tears, but she had no such wonders in her life. Her miracles were small and private, a child's fever breaking in the night, a field spared from frost, a loaf of bread rising just enough to feed her family. She gave thanks for those things, whispered into the wind when no one could hear. Still, she could not escape the feeling that God was always watching. The carved eyes of saints followed her through the church, and the weight of invisible judgment hung over her like smoke. She feared punishment in both this life and the next. A drought might be a sign of her sins. A miscarriage might be a warning. A house fire could be divine retribution. The connection between pain and guilt was hammered into her from birth. Yet even in this rigid system, there were moments of softness. A nun who offered her clean cloth during a pilgrimage. A neighbor who prayed with her beside a dying child. A quiet candlelit evening when the church bell rang through mist, and for a moment, she felt peace. Religion was not just control. It was also comfort. A place to place her grief, her confusion, her fear. She clung to that thread of comfort, however thin. She lit candles for the dead, folded her hands during storms, kissed the feet of a worn wooden crucifix, and asked for strength. Whether it came or not, she did not know. But she believed. She had to. In a life where every step felt like a test, she needed to believe there was meaning behind her suffering. Faith was not a luxury for her. It was survival. She clung to it not because it offered joy, but because it offered structure. Order in a world where chaos was just one storm, one illness, or one harvest away. When her child fell ill, she crossed herself. When the wind howled and wolves circled the village at night, she whispered the Lord's Prayer again and again, not out of deep theology, but out of desperation. Every word she spoke to God was a plea not to be forgotten. Yet even prayer came with expectations. Her posture mattered. Her presence in church mattered. Her silence during Mass mattered. The Latin liturgy washed over her, foreign yet familiar, never fully understood but always feared. She did not know the words, but she recognized the rhythm. It was the sound of submission, of small lives bound to larger forces. The church dictated what she could wear, what she could say, and how she should raise her children. If her daughter dressed too brightly, she was warned that vanity could open the gates of hell. If her son played too roughly, she was told to discipline him before sin took root. Discipline, after all, was part of salvation. Children were not born innocent. They were born with the stain of original sin. Her job, above all, was to wash them clean not with water, but with obedience. And yet, she could never fully wash herself. No matter how hard she worked or how faithfully she prayed, she remained suspect. Her body bled. Her desires existed. Her anger flickered behind her eyes. All these things marked her as flawed. She was told to be like Mary, but no one reminded her that even Mary had been terrified once. The priest never read that part aloud. In the village, saints were celebrated more than sinners were forgiven. Feast days were a mixture of worship and work processions, songs, rituals, and long hours of preparation. Women made the garlands, baked the loaves, and cleaned the chapel. When the relics passed through, they bowed low. If their children acted out during the event, it was seen as a sign of poor mothering. If their husbands drank too much and caused trouble, the shame fell on the wife. Some women found purpose in becoming anchoresses, religious recluses, who walled themselves into cells beside the church to live in solitude and devotion. It sounds peaceful, even holy, but the reality was bleak. These women lived in cramped, dark spaces with tiny openings for food and prayers. They gave up all personal freedom in exchange for the safety of divine approval. A few were revered. Most were forgotten. There is a lesser-known record from 14th century Norwich of a woman named Marjorie, who claimed to have visions and began preaching publicly. Her words inspired many, but the church quickly intervened. She was examined, scolded, and nearly excommunicated. Her crime was not her belief, but her voice. She spoke without permission, and in doing so, challenged the unspoken rule: women may feel faith, but only men may speak it aloud. Back in her cottage, she marked holy days by fasting or lighting candles made of animal fat. She whispered Hail Marys over her children's heads as they slept. She taught them to fear sin before they even knew what it was. And she feared it too, not just for what it might do to her soul, but for what it might bring upon her family. A failed crop might be punishment. A sick child might be the result of impure thoughts. She could never be certain. Guilt was the price of belief. Witchcraft was the unspoken shadow in every village. She might not even believe in it, but others did. A neighbor's cow falling ill, a sudden storm during harvest, an unexpected death. Any of these could trigger suspicion. Women who knew too much, spoke too boldly, or lived too independently were at risk. She kept her knowledge quiet. She used herbs cautiously. She offered cures in whispers, never in confidence. One wrong word could mean exile or worse. Herbal knowledge, passed from mother to daughter, walked a fine line. Rue for headaches, sage for cleansing. Comfrey for bruises, but too much familiarity with plants raised eyebrows. Better to pretend she had been taught by a priest or that the knowledge came from a dream. Better to act surprised when remedies worked, as if God had done it, not her. One curious historical detail from the 5th-10th century. Monastery shows how monks sometimes confiscated herbals from peasant women and copied the remedies into official records without credit. Their wisdom was taken, sanctified, and made official only once it passed through male hands. She, meanwhile, returned to her sick child without recognition, her remedies still seen as superstition. Pilgrimage was one rare path to grace. Some women saved for years to visit a holy site, Canterbury, Compostela, or even a local shrine. The journey was long and dangerous. Bandits, illness, exhaustion. But many went anyway, walking barefoot, carrying offerings. For some, it was the only time they left their village, the only time they were allowed to travel without question. Along the way, they found moments of peace, shared prayers with strangers, brief glimpses of freedom. And when they returned, they were still tired, still poor, but somehow lighter. Pilgrimage was the closest thing to escape she would ever know. Despite the weight of it all, she held her faith close. Not because she was forced to, but because it gave her language for what she could not name: hope, grief, longing. When her husband struck her, she prayed not only for his soul, but for her own strength. When she lost a child, she imagined them safe in the arms of saints. When she sat alone in the dark, stitching by candlelight, she whispered songs no priest had taught her. Songs about stars and forgiveness, about pain and mercy. Her faith was not always joyful. Often it was desperate, hollowed out by hunger and loss. But it was hers. In a life where nothing else truly belonged to her, not her name, not her body, not her home, faith was the one thing she could carry into the next world. And in her quiet way, she believed that somewhere beyond this hard earth, there was a place where her voice would finally be heard. Chapter 6. The Devil in the Kitchen. Food and Famine. The kitchen was not a room. It was a space beside the fire, a stretch of hard earth and soot-streaked stone where food was both prepared and prayed over. There were no shelves of spices, no fresh cloths or silver utensils. There was a wooden spoon, a blackened pot, a rough bowl, and her hands chapped, stiff, cracked with cold, and hunger. Always hunger. Every morning began with food or the absence of it. She rose before the sun to assess what little was left. A heel of stale bread, a turnip gone soft, a bit of grain hiding in the bottom of a bag. Her job was to turn these scraps into something filling enough to quiet children and strong enough to fuel her husband's labor. Sometimes she boiled water and pretended it was soup. Sometimes she scraped burned bits from the pot and folded them into mash. Other days, there was nothing at all. She did not eat first. Her husband did. Then the children. Then, if anything remained, she would eat. And if not, she told herself she was not hungry. She became an expert at silence while chewing, masking the sound of her own stomach. This was the rhythm of her life, not cooking for enjoyment, but for survival, over and over again, with nothing guaranteed. The food of the peasant poor was plain, repetitive, and largely determined by season. Bread made from rye or barley was the staple, dark and dense, often laced with grit from poorly ground flour. In some regions, flour was stretched with ground beans, weeds, or even tree bark during lean times. There were years when the bread made their gums bleed and wore down their teeth from the inside out. Meat was rare. If they were lucky, they might have a scrap of salted pork for winter, or a thin bone to flavor a pot of stew. Mostly, it was pottage, a slow-boiled mixture of water, onions, herbs, and whatever vegetables they could find. Cabbage, leeks, turnips, carrots were a luxury. Garlic and herbs added taste, if available. Eggs were saved for trading or for feasts. Dairy was precious, often sour by the time it was eaten. Butter was rare and usually sold. She skimmed cream when no one was looking, spread it thin on bread, and hoped it would not be missed. The fire was a constant battle. Fuel was scarce. Wood belonged to the Lord. She gathered what she could: sticks, straw, dried dung. A pot that boiled was a sign of success. A cold hearth meant empty bellies. She had to constantly stir ash, breathe smoke, and keep embers alive through the night. Some women slept with coals in a clay jar near their beds. risking burns to preserve heat for the next day. And then came the hunger seasons. The time between planting and harvest, when stores ran dry and the earth had not yet returned its yield. It was called the lean time or the Wolf's mouth. In those months, she watched her children's limbs thin out, their bellies swell with gas. She brewed thin broth from nettles, dandelion greens, and sour apples. She mashed weeds into paste and baked them on hot stones. Anything to trick the stomach into waiting one more day. In some villages, women boiled animal bones 3 or 4 times, extracting every last bit of fat. They scraped flour sacks clean, then boiled the cloths. They fed their children crusts dipped in warm water, whispered blessings over bowls of nothing. There were stories quietly passed down of women chewing leather, of mothers fasting for days so their infants could nurse. These stories were not myths. They were facts that never made it into the records of kings and monks. One historical detail, largely forgotten today. Commies from a famine in 1315 that spread across much of northern Europe. Rain ruined the harvest, grain rotted in storage, and entire villages faced starvation. Chroniclers noted that some women were caught baking bread from clay mixed with meal, knowing it would harm their families but hoping to keep them alive long enough for help to come. Help rarely did. Food scarcity was not just physical. It carried a moral judgment. If her family went hungry, it reflected poorly on her skill, her thrift, her virtue. Even other women might ask why her stores were gone. Had she wasted flour? Had she let mice into the grain bin? Had she angered God? Hunger became her fault, even if it had been years since a decent harvest. And yet she found a way. She bartered, foraged, begged discreetly. She grew herbs in cracks and corners. She knew where the wild mushrooms grew, which berries ripened first, which bark could be chewed for energy. She learned to bake without ovens, to ferment without cellars, to survive on less than most could imagine. In these quiet acts of alchemy, she became both magician and martyr. The kitchen, if it could be called that, was her dominion. Not because it gave her power, but because it gave her purpose. A pot over fire was the difference between hope and despair. The smell of onions browning in grease was almost holy. A full meal, even once a month, made her feel like a queen. She served it with pride, even when her hands shook from the labor it took to make it. Despite the constant pressure, mealtime could be a moment of joy. She watched her children eat with bright eyes, saw her husband sigh with relief. For those few minutes, she had given them comfort, warmth, something to hold on to. And in a world where nothing was promised, those moments meant everything. Still, there were dark days. Days when the cupboard was truly bare, when the baby cried with no milk left to offer. Days when the wind howled through the walls and the fire refused to light. On those days, she stared into the pot and saw nothing but her own reflection, tired, hollow-eyed, and waiting for a miracle that might never come. The devil, she sometimes thought, lived in the kitchen, not with horns or flame, but in the silence of a mother with nothing to feed her child. In the empty bowl passed around twice, just to be sure. In the shame that crawled up her throat every time she said, "Tomorrow, I promise." That was the real hunger, the one that lived inside her, devouring her from within. And yet she stood there each morning, hands steady, breath slow, and faced the fire again. She was not the only woman in her village to carry the weight of famine, but in her home, she carried it alone. When harvest failed, when blight curled the leaves of her cabbage plants and worms bored through the apples, no one came to check on her. She was expected to improvise, to be clever, to not complain. Hunger was not seen as a shared disaster. It was a personal failure. And so, with each lean season, she worked harder, digging into the cold earth with fingers already raw, praying that this time something would grow. In bad years, the price of grain rose beyond what peasants could afford. The Lord's granary remained full, but his generosity was limited. Some allowed poor families to buy bread on credit, but if they failed to pay, they were punished extra days of field work, the loss of a piglet, or worse. A woman's plea meant little in such dealings. The steward listened to her husband. If she came alone, she was sent away. There were no food banks, no relief wagons. Famine was not a newsworthy event in the Middle Ages. It was seasonal, cyclical, as expected as rain or snow. Only the worst years made it into records, but she remembered them all. The year when nothing green grew, the year when every child coughed through the winter, the year when she learned what it meant to bury a child with an empty stomach and then walk home to more silence. Despite the church's messages of compassion, charity was scarce. The local priest might distribute bread on feast days or bless a stew offered to beggars. But for the most part, women fed the hungry from their own stores, often at their own peril. If she gave too much, her own children went without. If she gave too little, she felt the weight of guilt. Hospitality was a virtue, but survival was not negotiable. In parts of Europe, strange culinary traditions arose out of starvation. Acorn flour, soaked and ground to remove the bitterness, became bread. Fish skins were dried and boiled into a sort of jelly. Stinging nettles were chopped, blanched, and added to stews. Even moss was sometimes scraped from stones and stirred into broth. These recipes were not passed down proudly. They were memories of desperation, of doing what was necessary to make it through another winter. She learned which roots to dig in which months, how to avoid the poisonous plants that mimicked safe ones. One mistake, one bitter leaf, and a child might fall ill or die. There were no second chances. She foraged with care, scanning the edges of fields, hedgerows, riverbanks. She watched the animals, what they nibbled, what they avoided. Her knowledge was not written. It was memorized, stored behind her eyes, passed from mouth to mouth in the hush of shared work. When she did cook a real meal, a bit of meat, a thick stew, bread with actual butter, she guarded it like treasure. The door was kept closed, the windows shuttered. She gave thanks before serving, not because she was commanded, but because she needed to believe it would happen again. These rare meals became small festivals, moments when laughter returned to the room and hunger took a step back. One year, she managed to keep a hen alive through the cold months. She fed it scraps, let it sleep inside, and spoke to it like a person. When it finally laid eggs, she felt like a miracle had landed in her lap, but her joy was short-lived. The hen was stolen one night, likely by a neighbor. She did not report it. There was no law for the poor to settle such things. And truthfully, she understood hunger made everyone into something else. Feast days brought their own peculiar pain. While the Lord's hall overflowed with roasted meat, spiced wine, and sweetened pies, she might have only broth and bread. The smells drifted across the village, a cruel reminder of the divide between those who had and those who never would. Sometimes a leftover bone was thrown to the servants or passed along to the poor. If she received it, she boiled it until it fell apart, the marrow soaking into root vegetables, making a stew her children would call delicious. It was for them the best taste in months. When famine hit hardest, families broke, husbands left in search of work. Older children were sent to beg in nearby towns. Babies died quietly in their sleep. Women grew thinner but kept working. If a woman collapsed from hunger, she was sometimes blamed for working too little or being too delicate. No one said it was because she had fed others first. There's a chilling detail in certain medieval wills and court records. Women who, faced with starvation, gave their children to monasteries or wealthier families in hopes they would survive. It was not abandonment. It was sacrifice. A mother who gave up her child was not heartless. She was choosing between certain death and a sliver of hope. Sometimes she was allowed to visit, sometimes not. The records don't say what happened to her afterward. She never forgot the feeling of an empty cupboard. The echo of it lived in her body long after the famine passed. Even in good years, she kept scraps, dried husks, stale crusts. She hid bits of food under the bed, in pockets, in folded cloth. Hunger, once known, never truly left. It haunted her like a second shadow. Yet, in the face of all this, she kept feeding. She planted when the soil thawed. She gathered when the hedges bloomed. She stirred pots even when her arms trembled. She said prayers even when she doubted. She fed others even when she went without. Her kitchen, though dark and smoky, remained the center of her resistance. It was not just about food. It was about dignity, about love, about the belief that those she cared for deserved to live. And in a world that offered so little to a peasant woman, the act of feeding was her power, her protection, and her prayer. Chapter 7: Wages of Toil. Endless work. There was no such thing as rest. Her days began before dawn and ended long after sunset, and even in sleep she was not truly free. She lay on straw beside her children, listening for coughs or cries, already planning the next day's labor. Fatigue was not something she spoke about. It was simply the backdrop of her life. A peasant woman's work was never finished, never measured, and never paid. She worked more hours than the men around her, yet her labor was invisible. It did not count toward the village's accounts or the Lord's tallies. No clerk recorded her spinning or her scrubbing. No priest praised her for nursing a child through fever or carrying water for a sick neighbor. Yet the village depended on her entirely. The tasks began with the fire, always the fire. She stirred the ashes, coaxed life into the embers, added dung or kindling. Then came the water, drawn from a distant well or stream. She carried it in wooden buckets that left bruises on her hips. If she stumbled, the work began again. Water was needed for cooking, for washing, for animals. She carried it back and forth, sometimes 10 times before breakfast. Then came the food: bread kneaded from coarse grain, soup made from yesterday's scraps, porridge for the children. She fed them quickly, quietly, then moved to the next chore. Cleaning, mending, milking, sweeping, weaving, spinning. There was no such thing as her job and his job. She did her husband's work when he was ill or absent, and her own on top of it. Spinning wool was one of her constant burdens. It was done daily in all seasons, at all hours. Wool had to be washed, combed, teased, twisted into thread. The thread had to be spun evenly, wound carefully, stored properly. If it snapped, the fault was hers. If it was uneven, it might not sell. Cloth was a currency, and her skill at making it determined her family's warmth in winter or food on the table. In many households, a woman spent over 40 hours a week spinning just to meet the needs of her own family. Extra thread could be traded for bread or tools. If she fell behind, it meant more than missing a chore. It meant real consequences. The work followed her everywhere. She spun while walking, while nursing, even while grieving. The distaff was a permanent fixture tucked under her arm, the whirl of the spindle spinning between her fingers, like a prayer. One often overlooked fact from medieval tax rolls is that a household's value was often assessed by its output. And while men's labor in the fields was counted, a woman's work at home was not. Her wool, her bread, her soap, her ale, all vital to survival, did not increase the family's recorded wealth. Yet, if she failed at any of them, the entire household suffered. In addition to her own family's needs, she was often required to perform corvée labor, unpaid service owed to the Lord. This could mean washing laundry for the manor house, helping in the Lord's kitchen, or even assisting with the harvest on his fields. Refusing these duties brought punishment. Complaining about them earned scorn. She worked long days under watchful eyes, then returned home to begin her personal tasks all over again. Seasons shaped the kind of work, but never reduced it. In spring, she planted seeds, cleared brush, and patched the cottage walls with mud. In summer, she weeded gardens, gathered herbs, dried food, hauled water during drought. In autumn, she helped with harvest, preserved fruits, butchered livestock. In winter, she mended clothes, chopped wood, and struggled to keep the family warm. Each season brought different chores, but the pace never eased. Sundays were theoretically a day of rest, but in reality, they were often just as busy. While her husband sat in a church pew, she might be bathing the children, repairing torn garments, or baking bread to last the week. If she did attend Mass, she often stood at back, holding a restless child, nodding along to Latin words she could not understand. There was no time for reflection, only routine. She was also expected to be a midwife, healer, and counselor. If a neighbor fell ill, she was called to help. If someone died, she helped wash and wrap the body. If a baby was born, she boiled water, fetched cloth, held trembling hands. No one taught her these things. She learned by watching, by doing, by failing quietly and trying again. Despite the constant demands, she was never seen as hardworking by default. She had to earn that title through decades of uninterrupted labor. A single misstep burned bread, a torn sleeve, a child with lice, and the village would murmur. They expected perfection, but never acknowledged the effort. The best a woman could hope for was to be called steady or useful. Anything more was vanity. Anything less was laziness. And yet her work was laced with moments of quiet resilience. A well-folded cloth, a garden that bloomed despite the frost, a dress patched with invisible stitches. She took pride in these things, though she rarely said it aloud. She could not afford pride. She simply moved on to the next task. There's a little-known record from an abbey in the Midlands detailing how, during a particularly harsh winter, a group of women gathered each evening in the church porch to spin by candlelight. They worked in silence, wrapped in wool cloaks, and took turns tending the single fire. They spun not just for their own families, but for widows, for the sick, for orphans. No one recorded their names, only their thread count. That was her reality, measured not in titles or land, but in loaves baked, children clothed, fires lit. She was the engine that kept the household moving, the glue that held the family together, the unseen scaffolding of the entire village economy. And still, her hands were never still, her feet never clean, her name never carved into any stone. She did not rest because there was no room for rest. But in the rhythm of her labor, she carved out meaning. In the scrape of the knife, the spin of the wheel, the hush of a child soothed to sleep, she existed not as history remembers, but as the quiet force behind it all. Even in moments of illness, the work never stopped. If she caught fever, she was expected to push through it. If her hands bled from constant scrubbing or spinning, she wrapped them in cloth and kept going. Her pain was rarely visible to others. It was hidden beneath the chores, stitched into her daily routine like a thread no one noticed but her. When she did rest briefly, fleetingly, it was not on soft pillows or clean bedding, but on a hard bench or straw mat, often with a child on her lap or the smell of smoke still clinging to her hair. One of the cruelest aspects of her labor was its invisibility. If a man failed to harvest, it was seen in empty barns. If a craftsman produced poor goods, his wares went unsold. But her work disappeared the moment it was done. Clean floors were walked on, meals were eaten in minutes. Clothes were dirtied again by nightfall. Her tasks reset every morning. There was no finished product to admire, only repetition, only survival. Her daily movements became so automatic that she barely noticed them. She swept the same floor in the same pattern. Every day, she folded cloths in perfect quarters, tied knots without thinking. Her body became a machine of care, trained by habit, driven by duty. She had no schedule, no clock, only the position of the sun and the rhythm of her children's cries to measure time. She moved with precision, not because she was taught, but because there was no other way to keep up. Though she was considered property by law, her labor was treated as duty, not value. She was not compensated in coin or rest, nor even often in gratitude. Her husband may have thanked her occasionally, or nodded in approval, but more often, silence met her efforts. Gratitude in her world was rare. Most men saw domestic labor as a given, not as effort. The better she performed, the more invisible she became. One rarely mentioned detail from early manorial documents reveals that even during festivals or market days occasions, when men might enjoy ale and music, women often continued to work in the background. While men bartered, drank, or played games, women hauled goods, sold bread or cheese, and gathered herbs to trade. Any coin earned was turned over to their husbands or used to pay off debts. Rarely did she buy something for herself. The tools of her trade were simple but essential. A heavy iron pot that had belonged to her mother, a worn wooden spindle, a knife kept sharp not for defense but for cooking and cutting cloth. Each item carried years of memory. If one was lost or broken, it might take months to replace. These tools were not only practical, they were anchors in her constantly shifting world. During the harvest season, the demands on her body increased tenfold. The entire village worked the fields, and she was expected to join them. With children strapped to her back or walking beside her, She bent low to gather wheat, haul bundles, and carry sacks heavier than her own frame. There were no breaks, no consideration for the blisters on her hands or the cramps in her legs. If she paused, it was to nurse a crying baby or to gulp down a mouthful of lukewarm water. Work followed her into the night. After the fields came the house. She washed clothes in cold water, pounded them clean with stones, then draped them over lines strung between trees or beams. If it rained, she brought them in, still dripping, and hung them beside the hearth. If there was no soap, she made her own boiling ashes and animal fat into thick gray bars that left her skin cracked and stinging. Winter brought different labor. With less sunlight and more danger, she worked indoors more often. She patched clothing, repaired shoes, twisted wool into yarn. Her fingers ached from the cold. Her breath hung in the air inside her own home. She fed the animals, mucked out pens, kept the fire burning even when the wood was damp and smoked heavily. She cleared snow from the path to the well with a shovel barely fit for the task. Cold weather did not reduce the work. It only changed its shape. In times of illness, she became nurse and healer. If a child fell sick, she slept upright beside them, soaked claws in vinegar, or applied poultices made from herbs gathered in better seasons. If her husband was injured or weakened, she took on his duties as well. She moved stones, repaired thatch, bartered in his place. She did so without recognition, because that was what wives were expected to do. Not for love, necessarily, but for survival. Children were both labor and responsibility. She cared for them constantly, but she also trained them. Girls were taught early to help with spinning and cooking. Boys followed their fathers into the fields, but not before being fed, dressed, and prepared by her. She watched over their injuries, scolded their misbehavior, taught them prayers and manners. They clung to her, cried for her, needed her, but often as they grew, they too learned to overlook the scale of her sacrifice. Despite this, she rarely spoke of wanting more. The idea of leisure, of sitting still for pleasure, was foreign. If she did find herself idle for a moment, she felt anxious. She scanned for tasks. She straightened corners, sorted tools, plucked lint from garments. Stillness was not a gift. It was something that came only when her body finally refused to go on. She aged quickly. By 35, her knees ached, her back curved, her hands no longer closed easily. Her face was lined by both the sun and the strain of repetition. If she reached 50, she was considered elderly, even if her spirit still flickered brightly inside. Some days she remembered the songs of her girlhood, melodies half lost beneath the weight of responsibility, and hummed them as she scrubbed or spun, trying to keep a part of herself alive. There's a folk tale from eastern France about a woman who worked so hard her shadow refused to follow her home one night. When she turned to look, it stayed behind, too tired to continue. The villagers laughed, but the story stayed with her. Sometimes she wondered if her own shadow might one day do the same, simply stop, sit down, and leave her to finish alone. Still, she woke every morning and began again. Not because she was brave or strong, though she was both, but because she had no choice. Her labor was her legacy. Her work filled the silence left by a world that never said thank you. And in the quiet rhythm of her hands, she carved out something close to meaning. Chapter 8. Eyes in the Fields. Surveillance and Shame. She could feel the weight of eyes on her before she stepped outside. Her neighbors watched from doorways and windows, their glances veiled behind polite nods and half smiles. She wasn't famous nor important, but in the village she was always visible. Her movements, her words, her expressions were recorded and remembered by others. She lived inside a net of scrutiny so tight that it became part of her daily clothing. She adjusted it without thinking, even when no one was watching. The village was small. Everyone knew everyone. Privacy was a dream from another world. If she rose too late, it was noted. If she looked too tired, someone whispered that perhaps she was sick or with child again. If she was cheerful, they wondered if she had something to hide. Her life was not lived for herself. It was lived for the perception of others. A peasant woman's worth was judged not just by her labor, but by her image. She was expected to walk with humility, to speak softly, to move with the restraint of one who knew her place. Laughter was acceptable only in the right company and at the right time. Tears, even justified ones, were to be shed in private. A woman too emotional was unstable. A woman too quiet was suspicious. A woman too visible was dangerous. This system of surveillance did not come from the Lord's Manor or the church alone. It came from the people around her, especially other women. They too were caught in the web, and sometimes turning on each other was the only way to survive. If she gained too much attention, others might gossip to protect their own reputations. If she stood out, even through no fault of her own, she became a threat. Her clothing was always part of the commentary. A too bright shawl might be seen as vain. A new dress might be questioned. How did she afford it? Was she hiding something? Even when she wore the same mended gown day after day, someone would eventually note how thin the fabric had grown, how careless it was to walk with a torn hem. There was no winning. Modesty was expected, but perfection was demanded. In the fields, she was never truly alone. Even among the tall grain or behind the hedgerows, others kept track of what she did. She was judged by the angle of her back, the pace of her work, the way she carried her basket. If she paused for breath, it was a sign of laziness. If she worked too quickly, she was trying to show off. If she sang while working, someone would say she thought too highly of herself. One overlooked record from a manorial court in 1319 details a woman fined for arguing with another in the field. The incident was less about the argument and more about her tone. The steward wrote that she raised her voice against a neighbor without cause. No violence had occurred. No crops were damaged. But her voice had been too sharp, too clear. That was enough. Even her relationships were monitored. If she was seen speaking to a man, not her husband, the whispers began. If she walked beside a widow, people speculated about what sorrow or secrets they shared. If she helped a sick neighbor, others asked whether it was kindness or self-interest. Every act carried multiple meanings, and she was rarely allowed to choose which ones others believed. Marriage did not protect her from gossip. In fact, it invited more. If her husband was kind, she must be clever. If he was cruel, she must have provoked him. If he left her alone often, there were rumors. If he hovered too closely, there were jokes. People saw what they wanted to see. And she had to carry the weight of their stories, true or not. Children, too, became part of this performance. If her children were clean and well-behaved, she was praised. If they ran barefoot through mud or cried during Mass, she was blamed. Their behavior reflected her worth, and any misstep, no matter how minor, became ammunition for others. A child's scraped knee became a symbol of her inattentiveness. A child's boldness meant she was too soft. The church reinforced this culture of surveillance. Priests warned of women's tongues, of the dangers of idleness and vanity. They reminded the congregation that even thoughts could be sinful, and that women were particularly vulnerable to temptation. If she showed too much intelligence, she risked being accused of pride. If she spoke out in defense of herself or another, she might be called a troublemaker or worse. In some towns, there were public punishments for women labeled as quarrelsome or gossipy. The cucking stool, a wooden chair used for dunking women in water, was reserved for those who were seen as disrupting the peace. Once accused, she had no real way to defend herself. Even if innocent, her reputation might not recover. Once a woman's name was tainted, it rarely healed. Surprisingly, even quietness could be misread. A woman who kept to herself too much was seen as haughty. A woman who avoided social gatherings might be called cold or strange. Her silence was not considered grace. It was an empty space others filled with suspicion. She learned to strike a balance, just enough presence to stay included, but never enough to invite envy. Some women coped by creating codes among themselves. A glance that meant trust. A touch on the shoulder that meant support. They shared news carefully, in corners, in whispers, wrapped in prayers and chores. Friendship was a necessity, but also a risk. If one friend fell out of favor, the other could be dragged down with her. So, loyalty was a quiet thing, unspoken. a gift carried in baskets and baked into loaves of bread. Her only true privacy came in moments of labor so physically demanding that no one bothered to interrupt. Kneeling in the dirt to scrub the threshold, walking miles to collect kindling, digging compost in the garden. These were moments when she could think without judgment. Her thoughts flowed with her movements. Here, away from questions and glances, she existed without having to explain herself. And yet, she internalized the gaze. She began to see herself through the eyes of others. She questioned her own laughter, her own rest, her own worth. When she smiled, she wondered if it would be misread. When she cried, she asked whether anyone would find out. The judgment had moved inside her, and it whispered constantly. Still, she rose every day and faced the village. Not because she was proud or brave, but because she had no choice. She held her head just low enough, her voice just soft enough, her steps just steady enough to pass unnoticed. But inside, she remembered who she was. And even if no one saw her clearly, she refused to forget. Sometimes the watching wasn't even about what she did, but what she failed to do. If she did not attend a feast, they speculated. If she missed mass, they assumed the worst. A bruised hand, a tired eye, or a broken sandal could all be used to build a story. And once the story started, there was no way to stop it. Silence was often her only defense. But silence had its own meaning too. Women like her were often trapped in a double standard of public morality. A man who drank too much might be excused as a hard worker with a bad temper. A woman who raised her voice once in defense of her child might be labeled a scold. Her actions were not evaluated equally. They were stretched and twisted by perception until the truth no longer mattered. Even her home wasn't safe from scrutiny. If she left her cottage untidy, if the smoke from her hearth rose at the wrong hour, if no bread baked on a feast day, all of it was noted. In villages with overlapping generations, a mother-in-law or elder widow might observe her every movement and report back to the community. Advice could easily slide into policing. Suggestions became expectations. Expectations became standards. And failure to meet them became shame. There were formal rules too, not just whispers. Manorial codes sometimes dictated how women could behave, dress, and interact. In a small town in 14th century Kent, a list of bylaws specifically targeted female behavior, restricting gatherings of more than 3 women without a male present. The justification was to prevent gossip and protect morality. But what it truly did was isolate women, divide them, and make solidarity dangerous. She couldn't speak her frustrations aloud. To voice unfairness was to invite suspicion. To complain about others was to become the very gossip she was warned against. So she internalized the injustice. It turned inward, poisoning her own view of herself. She second-guessed her tone, her decisions, her memories. She apologized more often than necessary, not to appease others, but to guard herself. There were stories she grew up with, cautionary tales of women who had stepped too far outside the lines. A woman who visited the woods too often and was said to consort with spirits. A widow who refused to remarry and was accused of bitterness. A girl who sang at odd hours and was whispered to be touched by the old gods. These tales were wrapped in folklore, but steeped in warning. Be careful, they said. Be small. Shame, more than poverty or hardship, was the tool most often used to control her. It followed her into motherhood, into friendship, into old age. If she struggled to keep her house warm, she was careless. If her husband left her, she must have failed him. If her child went hungry, it was her fault. Even acts of survival were judged through the lens of morality. Gathering berries too far from the village? Risky. Laughing with a young man while fetching water? Dangerous. And yet there were moments of quiet rebellion. She might sing under her breath while spinning wool. She might visit a friend at dusk and stay longer than necessary. She might carve a symbol into the wood of her doorframe, a charm against judgment. These small acts were not dramatic. They would not make it into any chronicle, but for her, they were acts of defiance. They reminded her she still had a self beneath the expectations. Sometimes she did push back. A sharp reply to a question. A refusal to explain her every action. A cold silence when gossip was offered. These moments were rare and risky, but they mattered. And when another woman did the same, she took note. It meant she wasn't entirely alone. There were a few safe spaces. The space between two women kneeling over laundry, hand raw from soap and cold water. The whispered comfort given after a miscarriage passed through herbs and warm cloth. A shared song sung just low enough not to be overheard. In these hidden places, outside the gaze, she could remember herself. Not as wife, mother, servant, or sinner, but as someone who simply was. Even the fields had quiet corners. A patch of shade behind an old oak where she could rest for a moment. A stream where she dipped her feet and closed her eyes. These moments never lasted long, but they were real, and in them she stitched her strength back together. Interestingly, some medieval women created coded prayers or rhymes that looked innocent to male eyes but carried deeper meaning. A French verse collected in the 1300s, often sung while churning butter, included lines that hinted at a woman waiting for freedom, not from a man, but from the expectations that drowned her. It wasn't protest, exactly, but it was memory passed on. Her daughters saw everything. They watched how she moved through the world, how she managed glances and gossip, how she held her tongue while holding the family together. They learned without being taught. The surveillance trained them too, long before they had cause to rebel against it. When her hair turned gray and her back bent with age, the eyes on her changed. People asked for her wisdom, but only within boundaries. She might advise a new mother, but not speak about politics. She might lead in song at a festival, but not speak out in council. Her value returned not as herself, but as a figure of quiet, contained experience. But she had survived. And for a woman in a medieval village, survival itself was a triumph. She had lived through the scrutiny, the shame, the murmurs behind closed doors. She had learned to see herself clearly, even when others did not. And though her story was never written in ink, it was remembered in the bread she baked, the daughters she raised, the strength she carried into every fire. Chapter 9. Bruises and Blame. Domestic Abuse. The bruises did not always show. Some were hidden beneath layers of cloth, behind closed shutters, under the stillness in her voice. Others were visible to everyone, but ignored just the same. A welt across the forearm, a swollen lip, a limp that didn't come from fieldwork. The village saw, but the village didn't speak. Pain behind closed doors was not considered a crime. It was a man's right, a woman's duty, a punishment she was expected to endure. There were no laws to protect her. If her husband struck her, the church urged forgiveness. If he beat her in the village square, it was considered discipline, not cruelty. If she bled, she was advised to pray. The idea of abuse as something unjust, something forbidden, did not exist. Authority lay with the man, and if he used his fists instead of his words, then he was said to be stern, not violent. In many regions, medieval law actually granted a man the right to correct his wife physically. The rule of thumb, often misunderstood today, referred to an English custom where a man could beat his wife with a stick, provided it was no thicker than his thumb. This was never an official statute, but it reflects a truth that went deeper than any written code society tolerated violence against women, as long as it stayed within certain boundaries. The church emphasized female submission in every sermon. Wives, obey your husbands. That line rang through stone chapels every Sunday. There was no unless he harms you. No, unless it breaks your spirit. Her pain was theological. Her suffering was framed as sacred. If she wept in secret, she was told to look to the Virgin Mary, who suffered in silence. If she complained, she risked being labeled a sinful wife, tempting her husband's temper through her own failings. Sometimes she didn't know when the first strike would come. Maybe the stew was too thin. Maybe she didn't greet him quickly enough at the door. Maybe he was drunk. Maybe the baby cried too long. Maybe he just felt powerless elsewhere and brought that rage home to the only person beneath him. The reasons didn't matter. What mattered was that she stayed quiet, kept the children close, and covered the bruises before going to market. If she tried to leave, there was nowhere to go. Her parents might be too far, too poor, or unwilling to intervene. The village would not take her in. the church would urge reconciliation. And if she did run, she became a fugitive. A woman without a husband was a woman without protection. She could be taken, abused, even enslaved, and no one would ask questions. Leaving wasn't just shameful. It was life-threatening. Her children saw more than she wished. They watched their father's hand rise, saw their mother's eyes flinch, learned when silence meant danger. She tried to shield them, to smile during meals, to hum songs at bedtime. But children notice everything. They carried those lessons into adulthood, some repeating the cycle, others vowing to break it. She could only hope they chose differently. Sometimes, after the storm passed, he would speak gently. Apologize, weep, blame the drink, promise change. For a moment, she would believe him, not because she was weak, but because hope was her only luxury. She had to believe it might stop. She had to believe the man she married still existed somewhere inside the stranger across the hearth. In public, she carried herself carefully. She wore long sleeves even in summer. She kept her head slightly bowed. She answered questions with as few words as possible. If someone asked how she was, she said fine. If they pressed, she smiled. Not because she was fine, but because telling the truth would accomplish nothing and risk everything. One forgotten account from a manorial court in the early 1300s describes a woman who was beaten so severely that the village healer had to visit her for 3 days. When the reeve was asked why her husband was not punished, he replied that the man had good reason, for she had not obeyed. That line, written without irony, shows how deep the rot went. A woman's injury was not evidence of harm. It was evidence of disobedience. And yet she endured. Not because she was passive, but because she had no alternative. Her endurance was not weakness. It was resistance. Every day she stayed alive, cared for her children, kept the home from collapsing. That was her act of defiance. She held her family together through sheer willpower, even as her own body betrayed her. She sometimes dreamed of another life, one where she was safe, where love did not hurt, where her hands were held instead of twisted. But she kept those dreams to herself. She whispered them into the fire when no one else was listening. They were not plans. They were flickers of hope that let her rise each morning. Even in such darkness, she was not alone. Other women knew. They saw the stiffness in her shoulders, the way she flinched when touched, the quiet in her eyes. They passed her warm bread, extra herbs, a longer hug. No one said the words aloud, but the understanding lived in every gesture. Compassion became their language. Unspoken, but loud. She survived by making herself smaller, quieter, less visible, but her spirit bent those remained. She sang when no one was home. She kissed her children with extra tenderness. She lit candles for herself, even if she told others they were for saints. In the small sacred spaces of her daily life, she remembered her worth, if only for a moment. The worst part wasn't always the pain. It was the isolation. The slow realization that no one would intervene, not even the ones who knew. The villagers looked away. The priest looked to scripture. The law looked to the man. And she, trapped in a world that insisted on her silence, was forced to carry both the pain and the responsibility for it. Some women tried to fight back. There are rare records, buried deep in court rolls, of wives who struck their husbands in self-defense or fled to a neighboring town. In most cases, they were punished more harshly than the men. One woman in 1354 fled her husband's violence and was taken in by a convent. When her husband petitioned the local lord, she was returned to him. The nuns could offer shelter, but not protection. In the eyes of the world, she belonged to her husband. A woman who defended herself verbally could be punished with a scold's bridle or fined for disruption. If she raised a hand in anger, she was accused of being unruly, unnatural, a danger to the order of things. The balance of power was not just physical, it was legal, spiritual, and cultural. She was expected to absorb harm and transform it into service. She turned inward instead. She found strength in the rituals of her day, laying out bread, tending the fire, cleaning the hearth. These were not glamorous acts, but they gave her a kind of order, a rhythm she could rely on. When everything else was chaos, she could still shape the bread with her hands. She could still sweep the dirt from the floor and feel, if only briefly, that she had done something that mattered. Her children sometimes asked about the bruises. She said she fell, that she bumped into a beam, that she caught her arm on the firewood. They nodded, young enough to believe, old enough to know it wasn't true. She wanted to protect them from the truth, but they were already learning it, not from what she said, but from how she moved through the world. They learned that fear lives in silence, that love can come with wounds, that survival sometimes means pretending. During festivals or saints' days, when the community gathered in cheer, she wore a smile. She laughed at stories, served food, danced carefully. If the bruise on her arm showed, she kept it behind her shawl. If someone glanced too long, she looked away. These events, meant to offer joy, were another performance. She could not afford to let the mask slip. There were other women like her, and she found them subtly. Shared glances, quiet nods, bread offered without asking. They never spoke of their bruises, but they knew. Sometimes, while washing clothes by the river, one would begin a story and let it trail off. The others would listen, not asking for details, offering comfort in silence. These friendships, though small and often secret, were lifelines. An old widow in the village once told her a saying passed from mother to daughter: a bruise fades faster than a bad name. It was meant as a warning: endure the blows. Stay quiet, protect your reputation. But she began to hear it differently. She wondered if the bruise was actually the mark of someone too strong to shatter. She wondered if staying silent truly protected her, or simply allowed the harm to continue. Some nights, she prayed for change. Not for rescue, she knew that would not come, but for the strength to last. She prayed that the children would grow, that the next season would be kinder, that her husband's rage would pass like a storm. She prayed to Mary, to the saints, even to the quiet sky outside her door. Anyone who might listen? Rarely men changed. Some softened with age, some drank less. Some found humility through illness or poverty. When that happened, the village praised them. He's a good man now, they'd say, but no one asked about the years before. No one turned to her and said they were sorry for what she had endured. Forgiveness was expected. Her pain was not mentioned again. One lesser-known tradition among peasant women involved the use of protective charms or amulets. A small iron nail hidden under the hearth. A knot of red thread tucked into the hem of a shift. These objects were said to ward off evil, to guard against violence. Whether they worked or not didn't matter. What mattered was the act of protection, the silent assertion that her body, her soul, deserved safety. She continued because she had to. Because the children needed her. Because the animals needed feeding. Because no one else would spin the wool, bake the bread, sweep the ashes. Her value lay in her usefulness, and so she remained useful, even when it hurt. Her story was not written in the village records. No one counted how many times she bled. No one recorded the prayers she whispered while hiding in the garden. No one praised her for surviving. But she did. She endured, day after day, not with joy, but with a quiet defiance that history rarely honors. In the end, her bruises faded. The pain lessened. The shame never fully disappeared, but it became a scar, not a wound. She raised children who remembered her strength. She taught daughters how to read the weather in a man's eyes. She showed them that survival is a kind of wisdom, that knowing when to speak and when to remain silent can save a life. And sometimes late at night, when the house was still and the fire burned low, she let herself believe that somewhere beyond the village walls, there was a place where women did not have to be afraid. She would never reach it. But she hoped her daughters might. Chapter 10, Widow's Curse. Alone and vulnerable. When he died, she did not cry immediately. Grief did not come all at once. It arrived slowly, like fog creeping into the village lanes, quiet, disorienting, difficult to name. She had shared a roof, a bed, a life of hardship with him. But when the breath left his body, what she felt first was not sorrow. It was fear. Widowhood did not bring freedom. It brought uncertainty. She did not inherit the cottage. It belonged to the Lord. Her husband's tools, his oxen if they had any, even the seeds stored for planting, all could be claimed by others. She might be allowed to remain for a season out of pity, or because she had children, or because her family had served the matter loyally, but her place was no longer secure. She had become a problem, a loose end in a world that preferred every person to be bound in marriage or servitude. The word widow itself carried a kind of unease. In the medieval world, a woman without a man was often seen as unbalanced, incomplete. She was no longer under a husband's rule, but that did not make her powerful. It made her suspicious. Without male protection, she became vulnerable not just to poverty, but to accusation, to exploitation, to erasure. Her presence in the village shifted. She was still seen, but through a new lens. Widows could not speak too freely, or they might be accused of bitterness. They could not laugh too loudly, or they might be accused of seduction. Even her silence could be questioned. Was she grieving properly? Was she mourning too long? Was she mourning at all? There were rules for how a widow should behave, but no mercy in how she was judged. In some villages, a widow's clothing marked her status. Darker shawls, simple hems, covered hair. Not every place enforced this, but the pressure remained. Modesty became expectation. If she dared to dress in color again, people would say she had moved on too fast. If she wore the same faded garments for years, they would call her pitiful. Her appearance became another battleground between grief and dignity. The church offered prayers for her soul, but not always compassion for her plight. A widow who cried too much was told to trust in God's plan. One who cried too little was warned that she must not take her loss lightly. The rituals of mourning were shaped by men, performed by priests, judged by neighbors. There was no space for her private sorrow, no room to say that her grief was mixed with terror and exhaustion, and the cold reality of survival. Her labor continued, harder than ever. What Tua done, she now did alone. Tending the garden, fetching water, gathering firewood, caring for children. The weight did not lessen. It increased. There was no second pair of hands to help stack hay or mend the roof or slaughter a chicken. No second ear to listen when illness came or food ran low. She became both halves of a broken whole and was still expected to keep the household running. If she had sons, they might be taken in by other households as servants or apprentices. If she had daughters, they became her help, whether ready or not. One young girl might be sent to another cottage to spin or clean, to earn bread or owe another mouth to feed. Separation was common. Survival required sacrifice. The idea of keeping the family together was often just that, an idea. There is a lesser-known record from a rural estate in Yorkshire listing a widow who petitioned the steward for permission to keep her husband's plow. It was denied. She was told to remarry or leave. This was not unusual. The tools a man used were not considered hers by right, even if she had cared for them, sharpened them, oiled them. The land remembered the man, not the woman. She became a visitor in the home she had once ruled. Remarriage was offered as a solution, but it came with its own wounds. A younger man might see her as a convenient match fertile, if not barren, experienced, skilled in household work. But there was rarely love, sometimes not even kindness. She entered the second union out of necessity, not desire. And in doing so, she lost whatever small autonomy she had briefly gained. Her property, her name, her body, all once again belonged to someone else. Not every widow remarried. Some resisted. They became midwives, herb women, caretakers of the sick. They lived on the edge of the village, offering knowledge in exchange for food, company, or lodging. Their independence was respected by some, feared by others. If livestock died or a child fell ill, the villagers sometimes blamed the old widow. Fear of female independence masked itself as superstition. Loneliness was its own quiet punishment. She missed the weight beside her in the bed, even if that weight had brought pain. She missed the familiar habits, shared bread, shared silence, the sound of footsteps returning home. Widowhood stripped away routine. It made the days long and the nights echo. And even when surrounded by others, she felt alone. She was no longer wife, not yet crone. Suspended in the space the world did not know how to honor, and yet she endured it too. Just as she had endured childbirth, hunger, cold, and shame. She found strength in small rituals, laying the fire, baking the bread, brushing her daughter's hair. She found company in the old songs she sang under her breath. She found pieces of herself in the quiet. Because even though she had lost much, she had not lost everything. Not yet. The village did not offer a pension. There was no widow's stipend, no social safety net, no guardianship from the manor unless the Lord himself took pity. And pity was not dependable. If she was young and still capable of bearing children, she was watched as a potential bride. If she was old, she was seen as a burden. The fields did not soften because she now plowed them alone. The firewood did not chop itself because she had no husband. Everything demanded more from her while giving less in return. What little she did own might be taken by legal custom. In many medieval regions, a widow only retained what was known as her dower right, a third of her husband's land if the land was large enough to divide. But for peasants, there was rarely anything to divide. The land was leased, not owned. Her claim was as fragile as parchment in the rain. If she stayed in the cottage, it was usually because the Lord allowed her to temporarily. In some cases, she was permitted to remain until a male heir came of age. Then she would be displaced. Other times, the land was reassigned within weeks of burial. She was then expected to move in with relatives or find another man to marry her. The idea that a woman might want to live alone, might prefer solitude to dependence, did not occur to anyone except the woman herself. One historical entry in the rolls of Lincolnshire in the late 1300s noted a widow named M who remained in her husband's croft 2 years after his death. When the steward realized, he fined her for occupying land without a male sponsor. She had not broken a fence or failed to work the land. Her crime was independence. Widows without sons fared the worst. A woman with a male child could at least claim his future labor and stay in her home for a few more years. But a woman with only daughters or none at all often became a drifter. She might beg. She might work as a domestic servant. She might end up in a convent not out of piety, but because it was the only place that would house her without question. The convent was not a haven. Though some were peaceful, many were strict, and none offered true autonomy. Her days would be filled with prayer, silence, and labor. She would scrub floors, bake bread, tend gardens. She might sleep in a shared room with cold stone walls and rise before dawn to chant psalms in Latin she could not understand. Still, it was safer than the road, but even safety had its limits. The roads between towns were dangerous for any traveler, but for a lone woman, they were treacherous. Bandits, soldiers, and even villagers could turn cruel when they saw a woman alone. A widow traveling for work or shelter could be accused of thievery, prostitution, or witchcraft. Her mere presence unaccompanied was treated with suspicion. Many simply disappeared. There is a chilling fragment from the accounts of a priory near Oxford in 1383, where a woman's body was found by a hedgerow. She had no name in the record, only the note that she was believed to be a widow. No one claimed her. No one asked why she had died. Just a passing reference, as if her life had not mattered at all. Despite all this, widows were not always quiet. Some became sharp-tongued, blunt, defiant. Age and loss gave them clarity. They had nothing left to lose. They stopped softening their voices. They interrupted. They advised. They sometimes scolded younger women for accepting too little from their husbands. These acts made them targets, but they also made them powerful in their own way. These women became keepers of knowledge. They remembered births and deaths, stories and songs. They knew which herbs eased pain, which trees to avoid during storms, which families kept secrets. Villages needed them, even if they pretended otherwise. A wise widow, though unloved by many, was rarely ignored. There were rumors, of course. Whispers of widows who brewed stronger ale, who cast glances at married men, who carried secret books or spoke with animals. Fear turned to stories. Stories became warnings. Warnings became accusations. In the worst cases, this led to trials, to exile, to violence. It didn't take much. A failed harvest, a sick child, a cow that wouldn't milk. Someone needed to blame someone else, and the widow, alone and unprotected, was an easy choice. But many endured. They planted gardens behind their small homes, even if the soil was poor. They boiled stews with foraged roots. They mended clothes until the fabric turned translucent. They lit candles and said prayers for husbands they had loved, or endured, or simply survived. They carried memories like stones in their pockets, heavy but grounding. Children in the village often came to them with questions. What herb to use for a cough? What charm to recite during a storm? How to tie a bundle for the road? The widow would answer, not always kindly, but always clearly. Her words were worth more than silver. She knew what others forgot. In her solitude, she built something like peace. It wasn't freedom, not in the full sense, but it was hers. She no longer waited for footsteps at the door. She no longer feared the tone in a man's voice. Her time was her own, even if her body was tired and her hands were swollen with age. She was not celebrated. She was not praised. But she was strong in a way that the village could not name. She endured the loss of love, of home, of position. She became something else, something outside the roles she had been given. And in the stillness of early morning, when the mist hung low and the earth smelled of rain, she sometimes smiled not because life was easy, but because she was still here. Chapter 11. Lust and Leverage. Sexual Exploitation. In a world where a woman's body was not her own, where every movement, every glance, every word carried consequences, it's no wonder that many of her deepest fears were tied to what lay within her own flesh. To be a woman in medieval society was to be constantly vulnerable, constantly at risk, not just from the physical violence that could come from an angry husband or an oppressive lord, but from the subtle, pervasive pressure that came with being seen as an object of desire, often against her will. The idea of consent was nebulous. A man had the right to take what he wanted from a woman, whether she was married, widowed, or even unmarried. Her will was secondary. Her body was not an individual right, but a shared commodity between family, society, and the church. And that idea was most clearly reinforced when it came to sex. Women were expected to marry, to produce children, and to submit to their husband's will, no matter what that will entailed. A woman's virginity was her father's to control before marriage and her husband's once wed. The church's teachings were unequivocal. The marital bed was not just for procreation, but also for the husband's pleasure. Women were taught that it was their duty to provide for their husband's sexual desires, even if it meant enduring pain, fear, or disinterest. This was not always a problem of marriage, but one of power. A woman could not say not legally, not socially. If a man desired her, he could take her, and if she resisted, it was seen as her failing, her rebellion, her sin. The medieval church, in its teachings, often failed to acknowledge the complexities of relationships or the individual agency of women. If a woman resisted or sought solace from another man, she was branded as a sinner, marked by her defiance. There were no protections, only strict moral laws and the church's insistence on obedience. Marriage to a man often meant submission to his desires without question. A peasant woman's labor did not end with the harvest or the firewood. It extended into the bedroom. Yet this was rarely spoken about. It was not an issue for discussion. Her husband's satisfaction was seen as his right, and her discomfort, even if known, was ignored. The social structure maintained a silence about her own needs, desires, or feelings. It was a world where pleasure was not for women. Women had no room for their own desire. Their bodies were not meant for their own joy, but to bear children, to serve, to please. They were not allowed to speak openly about what they wanted, let alone refuse their husbands. The church and the community saw this as necessary for family order. Anything outside of the prescribed roles, anything that could be interpreted as sexual independence, was a threat. One of the darkest yet often unspoken realities for many medieval women was the threat of sexual exploitation. Women could be subjected to unwanted advances from men in power lords, priests, even neighbors. The inability to refuse was not limited to marriage. If a lord desired her, he could take her. If a priest offered spiritual guidance, it might come with a demand for favors. In many cases, the woman had no ability to protest. Rejection could bring punishment, alienation, or even death. A powerful man could get away with almost anything. The same records that show men demanding sexual favors from women in exchange for land or protection also document the brutal consequences women faced if they refused. In 14th century France, some peasant women, for example, were forced into sexual servitude by their lords under the guise of feudal rights. These rights were seen as a mark of dominance, the lord's control over everything in his domain, including the women who lived on his land. Some women tried to escape this reality. Records show that a few attempted to run away from unwanted advances, seeking refuge in nearby villages or within the sanctuary of churches, though the latter often proved less of a safe haven than it seemed. The church, too, was a place where women could be vulnerable to the demands of men, even as it held up ideals of chastity and submission. In the absence of formal records, there are whispers in the cracks of history about those women who suffered in silence. Their names erased from time's record, their pain never acknowledged. What would become of a woman who was raped by a lord and became pregnant? She would be forced into silence, her pregnancy often marked by shame, her child ignored unless the lord took ownership. This was not a rare occurrence. It was the unspoken rule of the medieval system. One account from the court records of a noblewoman in 1360 tells of a woman who was abducted by a local knight during a festival and was found months later with child. She was never offered a trial or an opportunity to speak for herself. Her family had to marry her off quickly, and the child, though conceived through violence, was accepted as the nobleman's offspring. No questions were asked. No justice was given. In many villages, if a woman was the victim of sexual violence, the community often turned its gaze elsewhere. The blame was frequently shifted onto the woman. What had she done to provoke him? Had she been too forward? Had she walked too close to the Lord's house? Had she smiled too much at the wrong time? In many ways, the crime was seen not as the violation of the woman's body, but as an issue of her misplaced actions. Men were entitled to their desire. Women were expected to endure it. In the rare cases where women did speak out, where they found a voice strong enough to tell their stories, those voices were often ignored or dismissed. The reputation of a woman who spoke against a man, especially a powerful one, was quickly tarnished. She was often branded a troublemaker, a seductress, or worse, a witch. For centuries, these stories were buried under the weight of societal shame. Yet there were women who resisted, who found small moments to assert their agency. Some women, when given the opportunity, wrote. They wrote about their bodies, their experiences, their desires. These women, educated, often from noble families, were able to document the brutality they saw. But their voices were the exception. They were rarely the peasants, the women on the ground, whose lives were obscured by fear and necessity. And in the end, the world saw these women not as victims, but as silent sacrifices made for the survival of the village, the household, the community. They bore their wounds in silence, sometimes until their deaths. But in the quietest corners, they spoke to each other. In the whispers between friends, in the shared glances, in the protective embrace of a fellow woman, there was resistance. It was small, unacknowledged, but it was there. Despite the oppressive system of exploitation and silence, some women still found ways to reclaim fragments of their autonomy. Even if it was only within the quietest corners of their lives, they learned to navigate the complex web of power and control by recognizing the small moments when they could escape it, even if temporarily. But for many, survival was the ultimate form of resistance. There was no rebellion that could be written in the history books, no rallying cry that would echo across the centuries. Instead, there were acts of quiet defiance, the slow refusal to fully bend, even when every external force demanded it. One of the more powerful yet overlooked methods of resistance was solidarity. In a world where a woman's body was always under scrutiny and her freedom circumscribed, the act of women supporting one another was revolutionary. This solidarity often went unspoken, but was essential for survival. They shared whispers of secret knowledge remedies for unwanted pregnancies, warnings about men with dangerous intentions, and quiet counsel when it came to surviving the violence of their lives. The village kitchen, once a place of subjugation, sometimes became a haven. It was where women could briefly relax, laugh, and speak freely. The only time they truly spoke without fear of repercussion was when they were cooking, cleaning, and performing other household tasks in the privacy of each other's homes. This was their space, their refuge. In those moments, they shared stories and strategies, warned each other of the predatory men who roamed the land, and supported each other through the silent, steady work of survival. Interestingly, folklore and songs passed down through generations often contained subtle messages of female strength, encoded in seemingly innocuous tales. For example, songs about women outsmarting men or defeating monstrous beasts were not merely stories. They were parables about survival in a world where the rules were rigged against them. These songs were passed from mother to daughter, creating an underground language of resistance. They were never publicly spoken of, but were understood and valued in secret. A woman's sexual autonomy, or lack thereof, was often tied to the concept of chastity. The idea of the virgin was venerated in church doctrine, but not for her own dignity. It was cherished because it could be used as a tool to control women's marriages and their futures. A woman's purity was a measure of her worth before marriage. If she entered marriage as a virgin, she was viewed as untouched and unclaimed by anyone else. This, too, was a form of ownership. When a woman lost her virginity, she became the property of her husband, even if that act was not done by her choice. Women were supposed to safeguard their virginity for marriage. If they were defiled before their wedding night, their worth was reduced. But the reality of sexual exploitation meant that many young women had no control over their bodies. Sexual violence was often overlooked by those in power, as long as it happened within the confines of marriage or man's domain. A peasant girl who was raped might be blamed for not protecting her chastity, even if she had done nothing to provoke the attack. And if she became pregnant from such violence, she would bear the shame alone. The patriarchal nature of medieval society ensured that any sexual transgression was viewed through the lens of shame and guilt, and not the responsibility of the perpetrator. In cases of sexual violence, the victim was often treated with disdain, blamed for being tempting or for not fighting back strongly enough. Even if a woman was married, her autonomy over her own body was viewed as secondary to her husband's desires. Marriage did not free her from being sexually exploited. It simply legitimized it. Her body was not hers to control. There were moments of grace, however fleeting. The church occasionally intervened, albeit in a limited way, when it came to sexual transgressions. In some rare instances, priests offered counseling or penance for the men who violated women. But more often than not, the women involved were the ones who faced punishment, not the men. In 1372, for example, a woman in France accused a local lord of raping her, only to have her own reputation put under scrutiny. She was examined for her moral behavior and was questioned about whether she had seduced him. In the eyes of the court, the lord's actions were justified by her behavior. Women like her were left with no voice, no support, and no recourse. The church also maintained strict rules on birth control, restricting any methods that women might use to protect themselves from unwanted pregnancies. Herbs or potions used to prevent conception were seen as sinful, and women caught using them could face excommunication or severe punishment. A woman's fertility was considered a matter of divine will, something to be regulated by the church. The idea that a woman should have the right to determine when or whether she bore children was foreign, even dangerous. Despite the overwhelming control the church had over women's reproductive rights, some women found small ways to resist. Women passed down herbal knowledge through generations, potions that could delay menstruation or abort a pregnancy. These acts, while criminalized by the church, were a form of agency. They allowed women to take back control over their own bodies, even if it was done in secrecy. They weren't just surviving. They were finding ways to reclaim autonomy in a world where their bodies were not their own. Men who abused their power, however, were rarely held accountable. The laws that protected them were rooted in the same beliefs that placed women in subordinate positions. Men were not seen as capable of raping their wives. Their wives were simply their property. Even priests, who were supposed to be moral guides, often preyed on vulnerable women, knowing that their actions would go largely unpunished. The church, which held so much moral sway, failed to protect the very people it claimed to safeguard. Women, in turn, were expected to keep quiet, to suffer in silence, and to offer forgiveness when no one else would. Despite the overwhelming odds, women continued to resist in small, quiet ways. They resisted through their resilience, through their ability to endure. They fought back with subtle acts of rebellion, with their solidarity and their support for each other. They carved spaces for themselves, even when society denied them that right. Though they could not change the laws or dismantle the structures that oppressed them, they still found ways to take back their dignity, piece by piece. Chapter 12. The Weight of Silence, Stigmas, and Secrets. There was an unspoken rule among the women of the village. Silence. Not just the silence of speech, but the silence of truth. Women knew things about each other, intimate, painful truths that they would never speak aloud. These were the secrets that lived in the folds of their daily lives. Unspoken, because to speak them would be to invite shame, to unravel the delicate balance they had worked so hard to maintain. To speak would be to break a code designed not to protect them, but to control them. In this silence, women buried their pain, their abuse, and their suffering. They buried their anger, their disappointments, their fears. They smiled when they were expected to smile. They nodded when they were expected to nod. But underneath the surface, there were cracks. Cracks that no one could see. Cracks that even the women themselves sometimes did not fully understand. Because in the medieval world, to be a woman was to live with stigma sewn into every aspect of existence. There was the stigma of being a wife. A wife was expected to be dutiful, to serve her husband with quiet devotion. But she was also expected to do more than that. She was expected to maintain her body for his pleasure, to produce children at his command, to keep the household running with no complaints, to carry the family's honor on her back. If she faltered in any of these tasks, she faced judgment. The wife who could not bear children was seen as broken. The wife who grew fat from years of childbearing was seen as lazy. The wife who grew tired or showed even the slightest sign of rebellion was seen as ungrateful. And then there was the stigma of widowhood. To be without a husband meant to be alone in a world that did not favor the lone woman. A widow had no voice in the world of men. She was seen as someone who had failed in marriage, someone whose worth had been used up. And if she chose to stay single to remain independent, she was regarded with suspicion. Women did not live alone in medieval villages. They were supposed to be married, to be taken care of, to be protected. A widow who lived on her own, who made decisions for herself, was a problem. Her autonomy made people uneasy. A widow's grief, too, was weighed. She was expected to mourn, but not too long. The longer she wept, the more people questioned her attachment to the deceased. Some villages had rules about mourning periods, how long a woman could wear black, how long she could stay secluded in her home. After a certain point, she was expected to return to normal life, to resume her duties, to be the same woman she had been before. This was the expectation, but the reality was far different. Inside, she was never the same. She carried the weight of her loss with her always, whether anyone saw it or not. But there was another stigma that lurked in the corners of the village, the stigma of unspoken violence. The women who had been hurt, abused, or raped in silence, the ones who bore the scars on their bodies but did not speak of them. Sexual violence was an unacknowledged fact of life for many women. If a man took a woman against her will, if a man forced himself on a woman, the blame fell on her. The idea that a man could commit a crime against a woman was inconceivable to most. If a woman was seen crying, if she looked disheveled or scared, the village would whisper that she had been unchaste, that she had led him on. A woman's body, after all, was not hers to protect. It belonged to the man she married, to the Lord she served, to the society that saw her as property. When the silence of abuse was broken, it was often with devastating consequences. Women who were brave enough to speak out were shamed, ostracized, and sometimes even punished for their so-called promiscuity or immodesty. They were rarely believed. Instead, the story became one of her fault, of her seduction, of her own error. The abuser, if he was known, might suffer a brief reprimand from the village, but nothing beyond that. His reputation remained intact. His word was the truth, and the woman who had suffered became the liar. These silences went deeper. The idea of a woman suffering in silence was not just personal, it was communal. The village functioned in part because of the unspoken agreements between women to never air their grievances too loudly, to never disrupt the peace. If one woman spoke too freely of her pain, it might encourage others to do the same. And that would unravel the fabric of the village itself. The social structure relied on women keeping their struggles hidden. Some women, who had tasted freedom and lost it, came to understand the weight of silence differently. They learned that silence was not a shield, but a cage. They saw that the silence they had been taught to uphold, whether through fear or tradition, was the thing that kept them in place. But it wasn't easy to break free. The cost of breaking silence was high. When one woman spoke, she faced the risk of being isolated. But when enough women, when they dared to expose the truth they had carried in their hearts, it became a revolution. It wasn't the big rebellions that changed the world. It was the quiet resistances, the stories shared in hushed tones, the support offered without words. The women who leaned in close while spinning wool and whispered not just comfort, but truth. The women who spoke of their pain when no one was listening, knowing that their voices would echo in the hearts of others, even if they were never heard aloud. Over time, as villages grew more complex and the social order became more rigid, some of these silences began to break. But not without a struggle. Women began to speak about what had happened to them in ways they had never done before. They began to question the structure that had forced them into silence. Slowly, those whispers of truth, shared in the dark corners of kitchens and barns, began to shift the balance. They didn't change everything overnight, but they made a difference. The weight of silence began to lift, one small voice at a time. Her story, and the stories of women like her, were never written in the annals of history. Their struggles, their suffering, their resilience were often erased by time. But in the silences and the shared glances, in the quiet acts of rebellion, their truths endured. The weight of silence may have crushed many women in the medieval world, but it could not entirely extinguish their voices. Even in the darkest hours, their stories lived on in the hearts of those who remembered them. Chapter 13. Legacy of the Silent Strength, the Women Who Came After. As time passed, the stories of these women, the silent ones, the ones whose names never made it into the records, began to take root in the memories of their daughters and granddaughters. The next generations of women carried the weight of those stories, whether they knew it or not. Though many women in the medieval world lived and died in obscurity, their strength, quiet resilience, and the marks they left on the world did not fade completely. They were woven into the fabric of family traditions, in the gestures passed from mother to daughter, and in the whispered counsel shared between women. The medieval woman's life was one of struggle, of submission, and of unspoken endurance. And yet, the impact of her strength rippled outwards through history. The women who came after her may have been born into a world that seemed to offer them more rights, more freedoms, more recognition, but they still carried the weight of their predecessors' silence and sacrifice. They may have been free to speak their minds, to vote, to make decisions that affected their lives, but they could not escape the lessons that had been passed down. It is easy to forget the women who paved the way for this freedom, the mothers and grandmothers who lived under the shadow of patriarchal law, who carried the weight of their own oppression without complaint. What they endured was not simply physical suffering, but a mental and emotional toll that no one truly acknowledged. Their bodies were the vessels of survival. They made families, homes, and communities out of the scraps they had, often in the face of overwhelming odds. The legacy of these women began to take shape in the quiet spaces they carved out for themselves, the small revolutions of everyday life. They resisted in ways that were not always obvious. They whispered their truths, passed down their knowledge, and subtly shaped the culture around them. Their acts of rebellion were not dramatic. They didn't march in the streets or demand rights from the courts. But they fought with the most potent weapon they had, resilience. It wasn't until later generations, particularly during the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, that the voices of these women began to be recognized, if only through the lenses of male historians or poets. Even then, their stories were often obscured, their names lost or altered. Women who contributed to art, literature, and science, like Hildegard of Bingen or Christine de Pizan, were rare exceptions, celebrated in their own time, but soon forgotten in the grand narrative of history. But even in the darkest periods, the subtle power of women's stories continued to ripple through the fabric of society. In their homes, in their kitchens, and in the fields, they had developed networks of solidarity, knowledge that survived beneath the surface. When they passed on wisdom, it wasn't just about how to tend the hearth or grow food. It was about survival itself. It was about keeping faith in a world that had given them little room for hope. These were the stories of strength, not always visible, not always loud, but undeniably enduring. The women who came after these medieval peasants inherited not just their labor, but their quiet defiance. Their granddaughters grew up in a world where they could speak their minds more freely, where they had access to education and some legal protections, but they still carried the understanding that the struggle for freedom, for equality, was ongoing. Their foremothers had taught them, through example, that survival was a form of strength, that even in a world that seemed to want to break them, they had the power to endure. Despite the limitations they faced, medieval women left a legacy of quiet wisdom, of strength and silence. The act of surviving was revolutionary in itself. By simply continuing to live, by carrying on through the years of hardship, they sent a message to the generations to come, even when it feels impossible. Even when the world tells you that you are nothing, you're still here. You still matter. You still have the power to shape the world, even if it's only in small ways. When women began to demand more rights, to speak up against the laws that had controlled them for centuries, they did not start from scratch. They began with the foundation that had been laid by their medieval ancestors. Those women may not have seen themselves as revolutionaries, but their actions, their small acts of resistance, their quiet rebellions formed the groundwork for the larger movements that would come. And their resilience, in its most basic and purest form, would fuel the struggles of future generations. Even in the hardest of circumstances, these women held on to something essential, an understanding of their own worth, an awareness of their own survival, and the belief that one day things could change. They were not passive recipients of fate. They were not simply victims of their circumstances. They were agents of their own survival. And through their survival, they left a legacy that transcended the centuries. This legacy is still present today. Women who live through struggles, who fight to keep their families together, who resist oppression in all its forms, stand on the shoulders of these medieval women. The fight for women's rights did not begin with suffrage or with the feminist movements of the 19th and 20th centuries. It began long before that, in the silent strength of women who lived through violence, hardship, and who found ways to survive and, in their own ways, thrive. The legacy of the medieval peasant woman is alive in the actions of women today. Every time a woman speaks out, every time she demands equality, every time she asserts her right to be heard, she carries forward the spirit of those who lived before her. The strength that was passed from one generation to the next, the strength to endure, to survive and to quietly resist has been woven into the very fabric of what it means to be a woman in today's world. Their legacy may have been buried under the weight of history, but it was never lost. It lived in every woman who, despite the odds, refused to give up. It lives in every woman today who continues to fight for a world where her voice can be heard and her worth acknowledged. The medieval women who came before us, who endured so much in silence, laid the groundwork for the freedoms we have now. and it is upon their shoulders that we stand. Chapter 13: Legacy of the Silent Strength, the Women Who Came After. As generations passed, the legacy of these medieval women began to resonate more strongly. It was not simply a legacy of survival, but of transformation, of slowly changing the course of history through quiet persistence and unyielding spirit. These women, though their names were rarely recorded, became the quiet architects of progress. They laid the foundations for the waves of change that would come centuries later. Their strength was not celebrated, but it was undeniable. It was passed down through their daughters, who learned the subtle art of resilience. It was passed down through their granddaughters, who began to see the possibilities beyond their homes and villages. Each new generation stood on the shoulders of the women who had endured, their silent strength becoming the very fabric of a new world. The ripple effect of these women's lives is seen in the advancements women made in later centuries, though they were often still constrained by the rigid social expectations that their medieval foremothers had known. The process of social change is never immediate, never smooth, and certainly never without resistance. Yet the seeds planted by those who came before grew slowly, methodically, through generations. The Renaissance, for instance, though primarily a time of male intellectual flourishing, also saw the quiet emergence of women who dared to speak out. Women like Marguerite de Navarre and Christine de Pizan began to write and publish works that questioned the very foundations of a society that had long silenced women. They were rare exceptions, but their works would go on to inspire others. The voices of women who had been muted for centuries began to echo in the written word, challenging ideas about women's roles and capabilities. It wasn't just intellectual women who carried the torch of their ancestors. The women who worked in the fields, who served as midwives, who kept their families together, also carried the legacy of those who had endured centuries of labor. These were the women who fought against the structure of a society that kept them down. They didn't always have the vocabulary or the platform to speak of their struggles, but their actions spoke louder than words ever could. In medieval society, the division of labor was often clear, but it also left room for women to assert themselves in subtle ways. The woman who worked in the kitchen, the woman who managed the household while her husband worked the fields, the woman who cared for the sick. Each of these women contributed in ways that kept society running. Their labor was seen as secondary, but without it, the community could not have survived. They were the unseen lifeblood of the community, the ones who kept the family together, fed the mouths, healed the wounds, and nurtured the next generation. These were the same women who passed down wisdom in small doses through words, gestures, and quiet lessons. They taught their daughters how to tend to the sick, how to plant the garden, how to nurse a child, and how to survive in a world that did not always value them. These lessons were not written down in books, but they were written in the fabric of daily life, in the hearts of the women who had learned them firsthand. And even as the centuries moved forward, as women began to gain more visible rights and opportunities, there were still the invisible threads that connected them to the women of the past. When women gained the right to vote, it was not just the result of one movement, one voice, or one generation. It was the culmination of generations of women who had fought quietly and persistently for their place in the world. The women of the medieval world may not have known the word feminism, but their lives were the earliest whispers of it. The medieval woman's legacy also manifested in the way she shaped the world around her, through her familial roles. In a world where the family unit was paramount, women were the very cornerstone of family life. They were the ones who raised the children, who provided the emotional and physical care, and who instilled the values that would carry on from one generation to the next. Though they had little control over their own destinies, they had significant influence over the destinies of their children. It was in the care of the next generation that their power was most profoundly felt. Every daughter they raised, every son they nurtured, was another link in the change. A mother could not give her child freedom from the oppression of the world, but she could give them the resilience to survive it. She could pass on the strength to endure, the wisdom to navigate a world that would attempt to break them. The stories of these women became something far more significant than just narratives of hardship. They became blueprints for survival. They were the echoes of lives lived in defiance, not of the laws of the rulers, but of the very limitations placed on them. Women learned, through the experiences of their foremothers, that survival was not a passive act. It was an act of rebellion. The will to live was, in itself, a revolutionary act. The generations that followed carried forward the gifts of their medieval ancestors. The ability to persist in the face of hardship, to endure through pain, and to find small moments of joy amidst suffering. These women did not forget the lessons learned in the silence of their foremothers. They passed them down not as stories of victimhood, but as stories of strength. In the broader historical context, the change was gradual, almost imperceptible at times. But looking back, we can see that every movement forward in women's rights, every shift in the power dynamics between men and women, was rooted in the silent rebellion of those who came before. The medieval women who survived under harsh circumstances, who endured violence and exploitation, who never had a voice in the official histories, they were the foundation upon which later generations would stand. While the world they lived in was brutal and unforgiving, the impact of their lives was profound. They shaped the society around them in ways that are not always visible in the records, but they are felt in the lives of the women who came after. Every woman who fought for her rights, every woman who spoke out against injustice, and every woman who dared to hope for something better. She is the living legacy of those who endured silently. The legacy of medieval peasant woman did not end with her death. It passed through time like an ember from one generation to the next. Though her name might never have been written down in the annals of history, her influence was felt in every corner of the villages, fields, and homes. Her legacy was one of quiet endurance, of strength that did not shout, but whispered in the hearts of the women who followed her. It was the legacy of survival, the legacy of the woman who had been unseen, unheard, yet undeniably powerful. The daughters of these women grew up in a world where the rules were changing, though not always for the better. The medieval period was marked by fluctuating shifts in power plague, famine, war, and yet, through these trials, women found ways to cling to their dignity, to preserve their role in the family and society. They passed on the lessons of their foremothers, the wisdom of surviving, the strength to endure, and the quiet act of rebellion in the face of overwhelming odds. While these women were often defined by the circumstances they endured, it was in their ability to shape the next generation that their true power was realized. The mothers of the medieval world, though often invisible in the grand narrative of history, were shaping a future they could never fully enjoy. They gave their children the tools they had learned: resilience, patience, and the quiet courage that would one day bloom into the women's movements of the later centuries. As the centuries passed, the women who followed began to speak out. They found their voices, albeit slowly, and began to demand more from the world than the silence of their foremothers. The struggles they faced were different, yet in many ways. They were still shaped by the same systems that had bound their mothers. The struggles of the medieval woman, the fight for autonomy, the fight for respect, and the fight to be seen, carried on into the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and beyond. But it was in the generations after the medieval period that women began to understand their collective power. The teachings of those who came before were not formal, not codified, but passed down through generations by word of mouth. When a daughter sat at her mother's side, learning how to knit, to bake, to care for her own children, she was also learning the unspoken wisdom of resilience. The wisdom that told her that survival, even in a world that crushed her spirit, was the greatest act of rebellion she could make. And when that daughter grew up, became a mother herself, she would pass on the same teachings, knowing that survival was not just about enduring, it was about thriving, even in small moments. But the world had changed. Slowly, incrementally, women began to see beyond their immediate struggles. They began to understand that the suffering they had endured was not inevitable. It was the result of systems that were designed to suppress them. The quiet rebellion of the medieval woman, her ability to survive, to care for her family, to protect her dignity, had laid the foundation for a future that was not bound by silence. The daughters of these women did not just survive, they began to shape the world around them. In the 16th and 17th centuries, women began to demand more. They fought for education, for political voice, and for the right to control their own bodies. The legacy of the medieval woman could be seen in these demands, even if the connections were not always recognized. The battles for women's rights in the modern world were not new battles. They were battles fought in the shadows of history, passed down from mother to daughter. The fight was never completely silent, but the silence was deafening. And it wasn't until much later that women could stand fully in the light of the world and say, I am here. I deserve to be heard. The legacies of the medieval women are not found in the books of kings or the chronicles of battles. They are found in the stories that have been passed down from generation to generation. Stories of survival, of quiet resistance, of strength that was not always visible but was felt nonetheless. They are the unsung heroines of history, the women who lived and died in a world that did not appreciate their worth, and yet still left their mark on it. It was in the smallest acts of rebellion, in the subtle ways that women defied the expectations placed upon them, that their legacy lived on. A woman who resisted a man's advances, a mother who kept her children safe, a wife who, despite the abuse she endured, kept the hearth burning and the household together. These women were the foundation upon which modern women stand. Their legacy, though often hidden, is in every woman who fights for equality, for recognition, and for justice today. The women who marched for suffrage, who fought for reproductive rights, who demanded their voices be heard, all of them stand on the shoulders of those who came before them. The medieval woman's silence was not acquiescence. It was strength. It was survival. And in surviving, she passed on a torch. As women moved into the 18th and 19th centuries, the walls of silence that had surrounded them began to crack. No longer were they confined to the home, to the hearth, to the fields. They began to leave their mark on the world, stepping into roles that were once denied to them. They became writers, thinkers, activists. They began to reshape society, not just through grand gestures, but through the quiet perseverance that had been passed down through generations. The women of the medieval period may not have been able to demand their rights, but they had laid the groundwork for those who would come after. The power of their survival, the quiet strength that they carried through centuries of hardship, formed the backbone of a movement that would one day change the world. The legacy of the medieval woman is in every woman who has fought for her right to speak, to be seen, to exist. It is in the quiet defiance of every woman who has survived in a world that tried to silence her. And it is in the promise of a better future, where the voices of women, once muted, once invisible, are now heard and valued. Thank you for drifting through history with us. If you enjoyed this quiet journey into the past, gently tap subscribe and let the drowsy historian be your guide whenever sleep feels far away. Until next time, rest well, dream deeper, and remember, history is never in a hurry.